The house is quiet. It has always been quiet. That is the first thing you notice when you step inside, not the smell of old wood and lemon oil, not the particular stillness of rooms that have been arranged and left undisturbed for decades, but the quality of the silence itself. It is not an empty silence, it is a full one, the silence of a place that has held many conversations and decided, long ago, that it had heard enough. There is a clock on the mantelpiece in the parlour. It has been ticking in this house since before the First World War. You can hear it from the front hall if you stand still enough. A low, even sound. Patient, unhurried. It does not tick the way a nervous clock ticks. It ticks the way very old, very certain things always move, with the confidence of something that expects to outlast you. The parlour curtains are a deep green, the colour of moss on old stone. They are always drawn part way, letting in a narrow blade of afternoon light that falls across a Persian rug worn thin at its centre. On the rug there are two chairs. They face each other, as chairs in this house have always faced each other. Not toward the window, not toward the door, but toward each other. Two chairs, two women, two sisters who never married. That arrangement has not changed in 40 years. Their names were Cordelia and Josephine Alderton. They were the daughters of a man who had made his fortune before anyone thought to call it old money, and they were the aunts of everyone who mattered in the Alderton family, which by the 1950s meant everyone who mattered in 3 counties of the Connecticut River Valley. They did not speak loudly. They did not need to. This is a story about power that looks like nothing. Power that sits in a green parlour and offers tea. Power that writes letters in a precise hand and keeps its own counsel and knows things no one realised it knew. It is also a story about a house and the rooms inside it and what it means to live your whole life in the same rooms with the same person, and to love that person so completely that the outside world becomes, gradually, a thing that happens to other people. Come inside, the kettle has already been put on. You are in Connecticut. The year is 1953. The season is early autumn, that particular Connecticut autumn that arrives like a polite guest, quietly, without announcement, touching first the high branches of the maples before working its way down to the ground. The air has gone cool at the edges. The afternoons are still warm, but by 4 o'clock the light changes, turning amber and sideways, and the shadows go long across the lawn. The house sits at the end of a gravel drive that begins at an iron gate and runs for perhaps a quarter mile through old oaks. The oaks have been here longer than the house, longer than the family if you want to be precise about it, though the family would not appreciate your saying so. The house itself is federal in style. Red brick, white trim, 6 windows across the front, a fan light above the door, a widow's walk on the roof that no one has climbed in living memory. It was built in 1841. It has never been sold. The name on the mailbox is Alderton, a simple brass plate set flush with the stone pillar, polished on the first of every month by a woman named Mrs. Pratt, who has come on Tuesdays and Thursdays since 1939, and who has the specific hard-earned knowledge of the house that only long employment can produce. Mrs. Pratt knows which drawer sticks in the library, which floorboard speaks in the second-floor hallway, which window in the east bedroom refuses to stay open without a book propped beneath it. She knows these things and keeps them to herself. That is one quality the Alderton sisters have always admired in her. Inside the house, the rooms are arranged with the logic of a much earlier century, formal in the front, private in the back, with a wide central staircase that divides the public world of the house from the intimate one. The front parlour is used for receiving. The back parlour is used by the sisters alone. The dining room has a table that can seat 20 and usually seats 2. The library runs the full width of the house, on the eastern side, and its shelves hold books arranged by subject and then by year of publication, a system devised by Cordelia in 1924 that has not been altered since. Cordelia Alderton is 67 years old. She's the elder sister by 3 years. She has silver hair worn in a low, deliberate chignon, and she dresses each morning as if she expects to be received by someone important, though most mornings she'll see no one but Josephine and Mrs. Pratt. She wears wool in autumn and winter, cotton in spring and summer. She owns 7 pairs of good shoes, each resoled twice. She does not buy new things if the old things still serve. This is a principle she applies to objects, to relationships, to opinions. Josephine is 64. Where Cordelia is upright, Josephine inclines slightly forward, as if forever leaning toward the next interesting thing. She is the one more likely to smile first, to ask a question, to pick up a novel that someone else has left on the hall table. But do not mistake this for softness. Josephine Alderton has the quality of water finding its way through stone. Patient, persistent, apparently effortless, and ultimately unstoppable. She has simply learned that a smile opens more doors than a command. They have lived in this house together for 40 years. Cordelia came back first in 1913, when their father's health began to fail. Josephine arrived 2 years later, after the man she had intended to marry died in a road accident in the October of 1915. She came home for what she said would be a few weeks of recovery. She's still here. Neither sister speaks of this as anything other than the natural arrangement. They are not unhappy. They are, in fact, something rather more specific than happy. They are settled. Settled in the way a house is settled, with the weight of time pressing it gently but firmly into the earth. The family gathers at holidays, at Easter, and at Thanksgiving and at Christmas, and on the occasion of the Alderton 4th of July picnic, which has been held on the back lawn every year since 1889. On these occasions the house fills up. Brothers and their wives, nieces and nephews and their children, a cousin from Hartford who is always slightly underdressed, a young man from the legal firm in New Haven who manages the trust and who has learned, over 15 years of visits, not to recommend anything without first running it past the aunts. The aunts. Everyone calls them the aunts, even people who are not related to them. The minister at the Congregational Church calls them the aunts. The woman at the post office calls them the aunts. It is not a title of diminishment, it is a title of specificity. In the Connecticut River Valley, in the communities that know old money the way they know old trees, by the depth of the root system, not by the height of the canopy, the phrase the aunts means something precise. It means the women who know, the women who decide, the women who have been deciding longer than anyone else, and who have, in that time, become something rather like the house itself, permanent, authoritative, and profoundly, quietly necessary. Tonight the house is still. Josephine is in the back parlour with a book. Cordelia is writing letters at the desk in the library, as she does every Sunday evening. The clock ticks on the mantelpiece. The last of the amber light is leaving the windows. Mrs. Pratt has gone home for the day. The house breathes slowly around the sisters, and the sisters breathe with it. And in the gathering dark of an early autumn evening in 1953, the Alderton house settles a little further into its foundations, as it has done every evening for 112 years. There is a letter on the desk beside Cordelia that arrived this morning from her nephew Thomas. Thomas is 34 and works in banking in Hartford, and is considering a marriage that Cordelia and Josephine have been quietly, carefully, methodically evaluating for the past 8 months. The letter has been read twice. A third reading seems unnecessary. Cordelia already knows what she will write in reply. She has known for some time. She picks up her pen. The nib is gold. She has written with this pen for 30 years. The paper is cream, with the Alderton address engraved at the top in a dark blue ink that is neither fashionable nor unfashionable. It is simply correct. The clock ticks. Outside, an owl somewhere in the old oaks. The pen moves. This is where the story begins, not with a dramatic event, not with a crisis or a confrontation or a moment of revelation. It begins the way all real power begins, with a woman sitting quietly at a desk, in a room that has always been hers, writing a letter that will determine something important for someone who is not there to object. Let the clock tick, let the light go. There is time enough to tell this properly. The family has a particular way of arriving at the house. They do not knock, or rather they knock briefly, the knock of people who are announcing rather than requesting, who know the door will open, and are simply fulfilling the form. A nephew will appear at the door with his hat in his hands and a question already forming. A niece will come up the gravel drive in the middle of the afternoon on a Tuesday, her car slower than it might otherwise be because the gravel is old and the drive was not designed for modern automobiles, and she will stand on the front step for a moment before knocking, composing herself in some way that the drive gave her time for. Cordelia opens the door herself. Mrs. Pratt, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, will sometimes answer if her hands are free, but Cordelia prefers to answer her own door. There is something in the act of opening it, the specific moment when the house meets the visitor, when the inside meets the outside, that she finds worth attending to. You can tell a great deal, she's always believed, about how a visit is going to go from the way a person stands on a front step. Their posture, the look in their eyes before they compose their face into whatever expression they have decided to wear for the occasion. These first instants, before performance sets in, are often the most honest. The hallway of the house is narrow by the standards of its later additions and wider by the standards of its original construction in 1841. The floor is original, wide pine boards stained dark, with the specific unevenness of old floors that have settled and resettled over 112 years of winters. A brass coat stand stands to the left. An oval mirror in a gilt frame hangs on the right-hand wall. Visitors always glance in the mirror, usually without knowing they have done so, and Cordelia has noticed this for 40 years without commenting on it. The mirror is old. Its surface has developed the slight cloudiness of age that makes the reflection of anyone who looks into it appear, momentarily, like a photograph rather than a reflection, a still image, slightly sepia at the edges, of whoever stands before it. The letters that Thomas has written over the years fill a folder in the library's northeast corner. They began when he was 12, a school assignment apparently, that required letters to adult family members, a formality that Cordelia had received and taken seriously despite its origins in homework. She had written back a real letter, not a child's letter, and Thomas had written back again, and the correspondence had continued with increasing substance as he grew, and his thinking deepened and the school assignment became something else entirely. 22 years of letters, on both sides. Cordelia's copies in her filing system, his copies wherever Thomas files things, which she does not know but assumes is adequate. The matter of the proposed marriage is not simple, which is why it has been 8 months in careful evaluation. The woman Thomas wishes to marry is not obviously unsuitable. She's from a good family, old money in the New Haven sense, which means something somewhat different from old money in the Hartford sense. The differences being minor enough to be irrelevant to most people, and significant enough to be worth noting by people who understand the social geography of Connecticut's river valleys. Her parents are sound, she is educated. She is pleasant in person, or so reports from people who have met her at family gatherings suggest. She works, which is not as common as it ought to be in her set, as a reader for a small publishing house in New Haven. None of this is what Cordelia is evaluating precisely. Or rather, all of this is the background against which she's evaluating something else, something harder to name, but that has to do with whether Thomas's reasons for wanting to marry this particular person are reasons that will sustain him through the 30, 40, 50 years of ordinary life that a marriage requires. Whether the attraction he feels, which is real, she has no doubt of that, is an attraction to her specifically, or whether it is an attraction to the idea of being married, to arriving at the phase of life that marriage represents, to the resolution of a question that has been open too long. These are different things. Both are understandable. Only one is a sufficient foundation for what he is proposing. This is what the 3 questions in the letter address. Not directly, because Cordelia does not write directly about such things, knowing that directness in these matters tends to produce defensiveness rather than thought. She writes obliquely. She writes the way you approach a difficult subject in good conversation, coming at it from the side, giving the other person room to arrive at the centre of it themselves, rather than feeling that they have been directed there. She has faith in Thomas. He has, over 22 years of letters, demonstrated a quality of thought that she values. He takes his own questions seriously. He does not dismiss discomfort. He does not resolve uncertainty by choosing not to look at it. If she asks the right questions, he will look. The clock in the parlour has now struck 9:30. The library lamp is still lit. The letter is sealed, ready. Tomorrow the world will receive it, and begin doing whatever the world does with information that arrives carefully considered from a house at the end of a gravel drive in the Connecticut River Valley. For now the house is still. The fire in the parlour is ash. The maples outside hold their bare arms up to the October dark. Inside, 2 sisters in 2 rooms move toward the end of a Sunday evening with the unhurried confidence of people who have ended many Sunday evenings in this house, and know that the morning, when it comes, will find things approximately as they left them. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. The Alderton sisters did not come to power the way men come to power. There was no board meeting, no election, no moment when someone handed them a gavel and said, "Here, this is yours." Their authority accumulated the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a slow river, gradually, invisibly, in such small increments that no one could have said precisely when the riverbed changed. One day, without any ceremony, it simply was what it was, and what it was by the time you enter this house is complete. It began, as most things begin in old families, with death and money. Their father, Harlan Alderton, died in 1917 of the kind of pneumonia that takes stubborn men who refuse to rest. He was 68 years old and had been managing the Alderton Trust, the Alderton properties, and the Alderton name for 40 years. He left behind 2 unmarried daughters, 3 married sons, a considerable fortune invested across railroads and New England textile mills, and a parcel of timberland in Vermont that produced modest but consistent income, and a trust document drawn up in 1909 that had been meant to pass everything to the eldest son upon the father's death. The eldest son was Theodore. Theodore was 41 in 1917 and had by that point demonstrated with impressive consistency a talent for choosing the wrong investments and the wrong business partners. He had lost money in a copper mine in Arizona. He had lost more money backing a printing company in Providence that printed 2 issues of a magazine about sporting life before folding. He had borrowed twice from the trust, repaying once and not the other time, and the family had all understood, without saying so, which was the Alderton way, that the money Theodore did not repay was simply gone. Cordelia knew this. She had always known it. She had sat in her father's library on many evenings while Theodore's letter came in requesting this or that disbursement, and she had watched her father sigh and take up his pen, and she had understood that there was no system in place for what her father was too kind to name, the management of a person who cannot manage themselves. After her father died, Cordelia wrote to the lawyers in New Haven before Theodore did. She wrote a long, careful letter detailing her understanding of the trust, her concerns about Theodore's recent financial history, and her proposal that a family advisory council be established before any major decisions were made. She did not suggest that she be on this council. She merely suggested that the council exist. The lawyers, who had themselves been watching Theodore's performance with mild anxiety for several years, agreed that an advisory council was a sensible idea. They also agreed, when pressed by a follow-up letter written in Cordelia's particular style, which combined impeccable courtesy with the logical force of a legal brief, that the council should include family members with demonstrated knowledge of the trust's history and the family's obligations. Cordelia suggested herself and Josephine. She suggested no one else. The lawyers agreed. Theodore never quite understood what had happened. He remained the nominal head of the family. He attended meetings. His name was on the letterhead. But the letters that went out from those meetings were drafted by Cordelia, reviewed by Josephine, signed by Theodore, and returned to New Haven for filing. Theodore's primary contribution to the advisory council, over the next several decades, was to arrive punctually, eat the sandwiches Mrs. Pratt provided, and nod at appropriate moments. This was a more valuable contribution than it might seem. It provided the council with legitimacy. A man's nod, in those years, opened doors that 2 women's signatures could not. Cordelia understood this perfectly. She had no bitterness about it, or if she had converted it long ago into something more useful. She was practical in the way that people become practical, when they understand exactly which game is being played and exactly which pieces they have been given. She did not waste time wishing she had different pieces. She played the ones she had with a skill that Theodore, who had better pieces and squandered them, never came close to matching. Over time, the council's scope expanded naturally, the way a vine expands, not by announcement, but by growth. When Theodore's eldest son, Geoffrey, wanted to sell a parcel of the Vermont timberland to fund a hotel venture in 1931, he brought the proposal to his father, who brought it to the council, where Cordelia asked 3 questions that Geoffrey could not adequately answer, and the matter was tabled. The timberland was never sold. By 1945, it was producing twice the income it had in 1931. Geoffrey, to his credit, eventually admitted that his aunts had been right. This was the Alderton way too, eventual acknowledgement delivered quietly over tea. The council met formally twice a year, but the real work was done in between. It was done in the letters that went back and forth between the house on Alderton Lane and the nieces and nephews scattered across Connecticut and Massachusetts and Rhode Island. It was done in the conversations that happened when family members came to stay, as they frequently did, because the house was welcoming, the food was good, and there was something about the aunt's company that people found clarifying in a way they could not always explain. Something about sitting across from Josephine while she asked her particular, apparently casual questions, and about presenting your plan to Cordelia's quiet, patient attention. It made you see your own thinking differently. It showed you the gaps you'd missed. The nieces and nephews came often. They came when they were considering marriages, when they were considering careers, when they were in debt or in doubt or in trouble of the kind that you cannot tell your parents but must tell someone. They came because the aunts were safe in a specific way. They would not gossip, would not catastrophize, would not love you any more or less whatever you confessed. They would listen carefully, ask the questions that needed asking, and then say what they thought with a directness softened only slightly by the tea and the good chairs and the afternoon light coming through the moss-green curtains. What the nieces and nephews did not always realize was that every visit was recorded. Not literally. Cordelia kept no diary. Josephine wrote no notes. But in the memoranda that went periodically to the lawyers in New Haven, in the trust reviews conducted each December, in the property assessments that came up for discussion at the biannual council meetings, information had a way of appearing, the right detail at the right moment. A nephew's financial trouble, mentioned in passing over tea in October, that informed the discussion of a loan request in December. A niece's difficult marriage, described in confidence over the summer, that shaped the recommendation about a real estate purchase in the spring. The aunts never betrayed anyone. They simply knew, and they used what they knew in the service of what they judged to be the family's best interest, which was also, in their understanding, each individual family member's best interest. They were not manipulative, they were architects. The family was the house, and they were the ones who knew its structure, which walls were load-bearing, which could be moved, which repairs were urgent and which could wait for another year. Outside the family, this power was invisible. To the world, Cordelia and Josephine Alderton were what they appeared to be, two elderly maiden aunts in a large house in the Connecticut River Valley, with good furniture and a reliable housekeeper and a subscription to the Hartford Courant. They attended church, they contributed modestly to local charities, they were pleasant to their neighbours and remembered their neighbours' birthdays. They were exactly what the word spinster was supposed to mean in mid-century America: marginal, decorative, useful only in the domestic sense. Inside the family, the word that was never spoken aloud but that everyone felt was something entirely different, something with more gravity to it, something that, if you had forced any of the nieces or nephews to say it plainly, over honest drinks late at night, would have come out as this: the aunts know best. And the family, which had been following that principle for 40 years, had learned, through experience, through Theodore's copper mine and Jeffrey's Hotel, and a dozen other cautionary examples, that it was largely true. The formal structure of the Advisory Council, as Cordelia had designed it in 1917, consisted of 3 elements. The first was the biannual meeting, which provided the visible, formal moment of decision-making, the occasion at which the trust accounts were reviewed and significant choices were ratified. The second was the correspondence structure, through which Cordelia maintained ongoing contact with every major decision-maker in the family and with the lawyers who managed the trust's legal and financial affairs. The third and least visible was what Cordelia privately called the maintenance, the ongoing, informal, continuous work of knowing what was happening in the family before it became a crisis requiring formal response. The maintenance was the hardest to explain and the most important. It was the work of paying attention across the whole width of the family simultaneously, of holding in mind the 20 or 30 lives that the trust touched, and tracking their developments with sufficient accuracy to know when something was drifting in a direction that would eventually require intervention. This was not surveillance. No one was reporting to Cordelia. The information came through the natural channels of family life, the letters that family members wrote because they wanted to, the visits that happened because the house was welcoming, the conversations at Christmas and at the June meeting that filled in the background of people's circumstances. What Cordelia brought to this information was the specific quality of a mind that had spent 4 decades attending to patterns across time. She was not brilliant at any single moment. She would have been the first to say so. She was extraordinary at sequences, at seeing the connection between what someone had done 3 years ago and what they were doing now, at understanding that a pattern of small choices, each individually defensible, was adding up to something that would become a large choice, whether or not the person making the small choices recognized this. This was the knowledge that Theodore had never had, and that the trust had never flourished under when Theodore's judgment was unchecked. Theodore saw each situation as its own situation. He evaluated proposals on their own terms, without reference to the track record of the person proposing them or the history of similar proposals in similar circumstances. This was not stupidity. It was a specific incapacity for pattern recognition across time, the incapacity that makes people vulnerable to plausible-sounding things, because they cannot see that the thing sounds plausible in exactly the same way that the last 3 plausible-sounding things sounded plausible, and all of them turned out badly. Josephine's contribution to the maintenance function was the social dimension of it. Where Cordelia tracked the information that came through official channels, the letters, the meetings, the formal reports from the lawyers, Josephine tracked the emotional weather of the family. Who was struggling in ways they weren't saying? Whose marriage was under a strain that hadn't yet expressed itself in any formal way, but that was visible in the quality of the silences when both spouses were in a room? Whose children were developing in ways that the parents were not yet seeing because they were too close to them? This kind of knowledge required a different instrument than the one Cordelia used. It required the capacity to hold emotional information without reacting to it, to observe without intervening prematurely, to be trusted with difficult truths because the person sharing them knew that the sharing would not produce panic or judgment or unwanted advice. Between them, the 2 sisters held the family's complete picture. Not perfectly, not without gaps. No picture of a complex human system is without gaps, but with sufficient comprehensiveness to be genuinely useful at the moments when usefulness was most required. They had developed over 4 decades the specific fluency of partners who have worked together long enough that they do not need to negotiate their division of labour at every juncture. They each knew their own domain and the others, and they moved through the family's affairs the way experienced colleagues move through shared work, efficiently, with trust, without the friction of people who are still establishing who does what. The family did not know precisely how this worked. They experienced its effects, the letters that arrived at the right moment, the conversations that clarified what had seemed opaque, the sense that the house on Alderton Lane was always ahead of the situation in some way that was difficult to explain. A nephew who had gone through a difficult year would come for a visit and find that Cordelia's letters during that year had been subtly different, had contained different questions, had offered different kinds of attention than her letters of previous years. He would understand in retrospect that she had known something was wrong. What he would not understand, because it was not explicable without access to the complete picture, was how she had known, or how early she had known it, or how much she and Josephine had discussed his situation in the back parlour on the evenings when he was far away and could not know he was the subject of consideration. They did not discuss people in the gossipy sense. There was no pleasure taken in difficulty, no satisfaction in being proved right about a concern that had earlier seemed disproportionate. What there was, in these conversations, was the specific gravity of people who take seriously the welfare of those they are responsible for. A quality of concern that is distinct from anxiety, that does not require drama or crisis to justify its existence, that persists steadily through ordinary times as well as difficult ones. This concern was itself perhaps the most significant thing the aunts transmitted to the family over 40 years, the understanding that caring about someone means paying attention to them continuously, not only when things go wrong. Cordelia wrote letters every Sunday evening without exception, from November of 1917 until the arthritis in her right hand made it too difficult, sometime in the winter of 1968. For 51 years, 52 Sundays a year, she sat at the library desk and composed correspondence on cream paper with the blue ink address at the top, and the letters went out Monday morning with Mrs. Pratt's assistance, and the world rearranged itself slightly in their wake. The letters were never dramatic. They did not contain demands or ultimatums. They did not raise their voice. They had a style that Cordelia had developed in her 30s and refined over the following decades until it was as hers as her handwriting, which was itself distinctive, upright even, with a slight backward lean that gave individual letters the look of people leaning away from the wind. Her sentences were long but not tangled. They moved in a particular way, from observation to question to considered opinion, landing at the end in a place that felt inevitable, as if the letter had always been heading there. A sample. The year is 1939. Her nephew William is 31, recently returned from 2 years in London, and is proposing to marry a woman he met at a party in Greenwich. He has written to Cordelia describing the woman, her name, her family, her general pleasantness, and asking, with the careful language of a man who knows the question matters, what his aunt thinks. Cordelia's reply ran to 4 pages. It began by expressing her genuine pleasure at William's happiness and her affection for him. It moved in the 2nd page to a series of questions, not about the woman exactly, but about what William wanted from a marriage. What kind of life did he envision? What were his plans for the next 10 years? What kind of household did he imagine keeping? The questions were not intrusive. They were the questions of a careful friend, a thoughtful older woman who had seen enough marriages to know that the gown and the flowers mattered far less than the answers to exactly this kind of question. The 3rd page of the letter contained what appeared to be an observation about the family the woman came from. Cordelia had, at this point, already written to an acquaintance in Greenwich, a woman she had known slightly since girlhood, and who was well positioned to know the relevant details. The observation was mild and offered without fanfare. She had heard that the family had had some financial difficulties in the early 30s, which was of course true of many families, and that the father had since recovered his position, which was admirable and spoke well of him. She also mentioned, as if in passing, that the woman's older sister had been engaged twice before, and that both engagements had ended before the altar. This was noted without judgment, entirely without judgment. It was simply offered as information that William might or might not find relevant. The 4th page returned to affection. Cordelia wished William everything she wished for all of them. Not happiness in the abstract, which was a large and sometimes misleading word, but something more specific, a life of compatible companionship, shared purpose, and the particular comfort of choosing well the first time so that one need not choose again. She signed it, as always, with her full name. William did not marry the woman from Greenwich. He married 2 years later a woman from New Haven whose family Cordelia had known for 20 years. Whether the letter had anything to do with this outcome, William never said, and Cordelia never asked. But she filed her copy of the letter in a box in the library that she kept for exactly this purpose. Correspondence that had served its function and could be laid to rest. Josephine's contribution to the family's governance was different in texture, but no less significant. Where Cordelia worked through letters and legal meetings and the careful architecture of paperwork, Josephine worked through conversation. She was a remarkable conversationalist, not because she was witty, though she was, and not because she had wide knowledge, though she had that too, but because of something harder to name. She had the quality of making you feel that your thoughts were worth following wherever they led. She asked questions that felt like invitations. She listened with her whole face. And somewhere in the course of a conversation with Josephine, you would often find yourself saying things you'd not expected to say, arriving at conclusions about yourself that you had been, up to that moment, successfully avoiding. Her niece Eleanor came to stay in the spring of 1946. Eleanor was 23, recently graduated from Smith College, and was under considerable pressure from her parents to accept an offer of marriage from a young man in the insurance business. The young man was pleasant. His prospects were solid. Her parents could not understand her hesitation and were growing impatient. Eleanor came to the house on Alderton Lane to think, she said, because it was quiet there, and because the aunts did not mind if you sat in the garden. She sat in the garden for 2 days. On the 3rd day, Josephine joined her with a tray of tea and the comfortable silence she had perfected over a lifetime of knowing when to speak and when not to. On the 4th day, they talked. Not about the young man, not at first. About Eleanor's time at Smith. About what she had studied there. She had written a thesis on the economic history of New England textile mills, a topic she had chosen, it turned out, because of a conversation she'd had as a child with Cordelia about the Alderton family's own holdings, about what she had wanted to be before she had begun wanting to be what her parents wanted her to be. By the end of the conversation, it lasted through tea and dinner and part of the evening, with easy gaps for the serving and the clearing and the settling into chairs. Eleanor had told Josephine that she wanted to study law. She had not told her parents. She had not, before that afternoon, told anyone. Josephine listened to this and asked whether Eleanor had looked into programs, and Eleanor admitted she had spent her last semester sending inquiries to Yale Law and Columbia. Josephine asked about the responses. Eleanor, very quietly, produced them from the inside pocket of her cardigan. The young man in insurance was written a very kind letter by Eleanor the following week. Josephine helped her draft it. Not the words exactly, but the structure, the tone, the way of being clear without being cruel. Eleanor enrolled at Yale Law in September 1947. She practiced family law in New Haven for 35 years and was by every account excellent at it. She visited the aunts every Christmas until they were too old to receive visitors, and she always brought something useful, a particularly good tin of tea, a book she'd found that she thought Cordelia would want, a bottle of the specific sherry that Josephine liked, which was not easy to find. Years later, much later, Eleanor was asked by a reporter writing a piece about women in the law what had shaped her decision to pursue a legal career at a time when women in law were uncommon and not always welcomed. She said several things. She talked about her professors. She talked about her mother eventually. She talked about what she had seen in her own work, the families that came through difficult divorces, the estates that went wrong, the children caught in the middle of decisions that adults made without thinking. She did not mention the conversation in the garden on Alderton Lane. She mentioned it only to herself, in the particular private accounting that people keep of the moments that actually made them. The house holds many such moments. If you sit in the back parlour long enough, in one of the two chairs that face each other across the worn Persian rug, you can almost feel them, the specific gravity of conversations that change things. The air is a little heavier here than it is in the front parlour, though perhaps that is only the curtains. Perhaps it is only the old wood of the chairs, which have been sat in so long they have taken on the shape of the people who sat in them. Cordelia's chair has a slight give on the right side, where her elbow always rested. Josephine's is thinner at the seat. The cushions have been replaced twice in 40 years, but the chairs themselves have not changed. They do not need to change. They have already become what they were always going to become, which is part of a room, part of a house, part of the particular accumulated weight of two women who understood, from very early on, that patience was not the opposite of power, but its deepest form. The letter-writing practice that Cordelia maintained for 51 years was not only a tool of family governance, it was, for her, also a form of thinking. The act of writing a letter, of organising her observations into sentences that another person would read, required her to do something she could not do in the privacy of her own thought, to commit. To take what was inchoate and feeling-shaped in her mind, and turn it into something that had a beginning and a middle and an end, that said what it meant and could be held accountable for saying it. She found this process clarifying in the way that all external expression is clarifying. It showed you what you actually thought, as opposed to what you imagined you thought. She had begun letter writing as a practical necessity in 1917, when the trust required correspondence, and she was the person equipped to conduct it. But it had become, over years, something she also did for herself, in letters that were not about the trust at all, but about what she was reading, what she was noticing, what the garden had done that week, what Josephine had said over tea that struck her as worth repeating. These letters went to a woman named Dorothy Hull, a friend from her girlhood who had married and moved to Philadelphia, and who had maintained a correspondence with Cordelia since 1906. 50 years of letters, from two women who saw each other perhaps twice a decade and who knew each other, in the letter sense, more completely than people who lived in the same city. Dorothy Hull's letters came from Philadelphia in an envelope with a small return address engraved in red ink, a detail Cordelia had always liked. They were warm letters, prodigal with observation and opinion, and the specific humour of a woman who found the world consistently interesting. They offered Cordelia something the family letters did not offer, a view of her own life from the outside. Dorothy had no stake in the trust's governance. She had no need from Cordelia that expressed itself in financial or practical terms. She simply enjoyed Cordelia's company, in the letter sense, and Cordelia enjoyed hers, and the exchange between them had the specific quality of pleasure that is available only in relationships that are entirely voluntary and that have been maintained over a long time, and in which both parties have, consequently, been seen in various seasons and weathers of life. Josephine knew about Dorothy Hull the way she knew about most of the contents of Cordelia's private life, which was fully but without intrusion. She had met Dorothy twice. She understood what the correspondence meant to Cordelia and respected it as she respected everything that belonged properly to the other's private sphere. When Dorothy Hull died, in 1961, she died in Philadelphia, and a letter came from her daughter informing Cordelia of the fact with the formal brevity of bereavement notices. Cordelia read the letter at the library desk and sat very still for a period of time that she did not measure. Then she went to the back parlour and sat with Josephine, who had seen the letter on the desk and understood what it meant, and they sat together without talking, in the particular companionship of the bereaved, for the rest of the afternoon. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. There is a room on the second floor of the Alderton house that has not changed since 1891. It was their mother's room, Catherine Alderton, née Whitmore, who died in 1916 at the age of 71 after a quiet life of considerable competence that went largely unremarked because it expressed itself entirely within the domestic sphere, which was the only sphere available to women of her class and generation. Catherine kept accounts in a small leather-bound book with marbled endpapers. She managed the household budget with an exactness that her husband respected without fully understanding. She knew how much coal was needed for the winter, how much linen to order from the dry goods store in town, how many quarts of preserves were required to carry the family from October through to April. These were not trivial calculations. They were the calculations on which a household's survival depended, and Catherine had made them every year for 40 years without once getting them wrong. When Catherine died, Cordelia moved into the room. Not immediately. It took some months before the room felt ready for that, before the grief had settled enough to allow ordinary life to resume. But eventually Cordelia came upstairs with a clean set of curtains and a different reading lamp, and arranged things according to her own preferences, which were similar to her mother's in most respects because most preferences, in old houses, are inherited along with the furniture. The marbled account book was moved to the library, where Cordelia used it as the model for her own household records, which she kept in exactly the same format until the day she could no longer write. The room faces east. In the mornings, particularly in autumn when the light comes in at a low angle through the maples, the room fills with a kind of gold that is specific to New England autumns, and that people from elsewhere sometimes find impossible to describe accurately. It is not merely yellow, it has texture to it, a warmth without heat, a brightness that does not glare. Cordelia had woken to this light for 50-odd years. She expected it would be the last thing she saw on any given morning, and the expectation had given her a contentment with early hours that she might not otherwise have had. Josephine's room is across the hall. It faces west, which means she sees the light at the end of the day rather than the beginning. This suits her. She's always been a better evening person than a morning one, more alert after supper than before breakfast, more inclined to read late than to rise early. The arrangement had evolved naturally, the way everything in the house had evolved, through long use and small accommodation, and the accumulated understanding of two people who knew each other completely, and had therefore learned which accommodations cost nothing and which ones mattered. The rooms are not luxurious. They are good rooms, well appointed without excess. The beds have proper headboards and mattresses that have been replaced on schedule. The wardrobes are deep and smell of cedar. The rugs are clean, and the windowsills are free of dust, and on each nightstand there is a reading lamp and a glass of water and whatever book the occupant is currently working through. Cordelia tends toward history and biography. Josephine tends toward novels, though she's not sentimental about them. She reads them the way a surgeon reads anatomy, with professional interest in their structure and an appreciation for when the construction is sound. The house has 12 rooms in total, though some of them are now used for storage. The guest room that used to hold visiting nieces and nephews, now shelving books that have overflowed from the library. The sewing room that Catherine had used, and that her daughters had never had occasion for in the same way. A small room at the back of the second floor with a single window overlooking the garden that had once been used by a live-in housemaid, in the era when live-in housemaids were part of a house of this kind. Mrs. Pratt lives at her own home in the village and arrives on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The room has been empty since 1933, its furniture still there, its curtains still hanging, a presence of absence that the sisters do not think about often, but that neither has suggested clearing out. A house accumulates its history in rooms like that, not in the grand rooms, which are always being used for something and therefore cleaned and refreshed and made ready for the next occasion, but in the quiet rooms that have been set aside from active use. The memory of a house lives in its unused rooms the way memory lives in people, faint, specific, surprisingly durable when you encounter it. Downstairs, the kitchen is the room that has changed the most over the years. There have been 3 stoves. The icebox became a proper refrigerator in 1936. The pump was replaced with running water in 1919. The tiles around the sink, which are white with a blue pattern that Catherine chose sometime in the 1880s, have never been changed. Each tile has a slight variation in its pattern, the hand painting visible if you look closely, and the effect running along the backsplash for 6 feet is of a thing made carefully, by someone who was thinking about it, who understood that a kitchen is a place where you spend a great deal of time, and therefore the things you look at there should be worth looking at. Mrs. Pratt makes tea in this kitchen on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. She makes it in a brown earthenware pot that has been in use since at least 1940, and that has, in the way of objects that are used daily and washed carefully and respected, developed a quality of absolute reliability. The tea is always the same, an Indian blend that Josephine orders by the quarter-pound from a shop in New Haven. It is not a fashionable tea. It is not the tea that people serve when they want to make an impression. It is the tea you drink when you have been drinking the same tea for long enough that any other tea would taste wrong. The kitchen window looks out over the kitchen garden. In spring and summer this garden produces tomatoes, beans, herbs, the particular variety of cucumber that Cordelia prefers. Mrs. Pratt tends it on Thursday afternoons after the indoor work is done. She brings home what the sisters cannot use, the overflow of tomatoes in August, the excess cucumbers in July. This arrangement has never been discussed. It simply developed, the way practical arrangements develop between people who understand each other's situations without requiring explanation. The front of the house faces south. From the front parlour windows, if you part the green curtains, you can see the gravel drive and the iron gate and the road beyond it. On weekday mornings the mail comes at 10. On Saturdays it comes at 11. Cordelia is usually at the window at these times, not waiting exactly. She's always doing something else, reading or writing, but positioned so that she notices when the mail arrives. The letters matter. They have always mattered. A house like this one at this period receives a particular quality of correspondence, not the bills and the catalogues that fill ordinary mailboxes. The bills and catalogues come too, but they are secondary. What matters are the family letters, the typewritten pages from nephews in business in Hartford, the handwritten notes from nieces in New Haven and Providence, the occasional more formal letters from lawyers or bank officers, or rarely from people outside the family entirely who have reason to communicate with the Alderton Trust. Each letter is read, considered, and replied to. Each reply is filed. The filing system in the library is Cordelia's creation and reflects her mind. Logical, categorical, slightly austere. There are folders for each member of the family. There are folders for each major property. There are folders for the trust itself, organised by year and by subject. These folders represent 40 years of decision-making, annotated in Cordelia's backward-leaning hand. They are, in a sense, the actual record of the Alderton family's history, not the births and deaths recorded in the family Bible in the front parlour, but the living history of choices made and choices avoided, of money protected and money risked, and the long, patient work of keeping a family whole. The light is fading now in the east room and the west room both. The maples outside the windows are going dark. Inside, the house is settling into its evening habits. The tick of the clock in the parlour, the low sound of Josephine turning a page in the back room, the occasional creak of the floorboard in the hall that speaks when the temperature drops and the old wood contracts. These are the sounds of a house at rest, of a day completed, of a life lived largely in these rooms, still in progress and not yet ready to be described as finished. The back staircase is narrow and dark. It was the servants' stair in the house's original configuration, before the household reduced from 5 live-in staff in the 1890s to Mrs. Pratt on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The sisters use this staircase more than the front one because it is shorter from the kitchen, which is where they most often are when they need to go upstairs. Its walls hold a sequence of small framed botanical drawings that Josephine collected in the 30s, one per year, from a dealer in Providence who specialised in antique natural history prints. The drawings are precise and uncoloured, pen and wash, and they show in careful detail the plants that appear in the garden, the tomato, the bean, the thyme, the particular variety of English lavender that Josephine grows in the south bed's corner. The cellar beneath the house is the room that most people never see. It runs the full footprint of the original structure, with stone walls and a packed earth floor, and the specific smell of underground places that have been dry for a very long time. A cool, mineral smell, slightly sweet. The preserve shelves are here, running along the west wall, their contents labelled in Josephine's handwriting with the year and the contents. There are jars from 1948 that she has not yet used, because newer jars kept appearing in front of them, and the older ones receded. She will use them eventually. The tomatoes in those jars are still good. She knows this because she looked at one on a Tuesday last spring and the seal was intact and the colour was still deep and the smell, when she opened it briefly to check, was still the smell of August. Upstairs, in the linen closet at the top of the front staircase, the shelves are organised by size and by frequency of use. The sheets for the guest room, which is not used as a guest room anymore, are on the top shelf in their pillowcases, folded into themselves the way Cordelia was taught by her mother and taught herself to do. The towels are on the middle shelf, organised by thickness. The tablecloths for the dining room are on the bottom shelf, folded precisely and interleaved with tissue paper to prevent the long creases that develop when fabric is folded in the same place too many times. These small domestic precisions are not obsessions. They are the accumulated practice of people who understand that things last longer when they are cared for properly, and who find in that caring a satisfaction that is not diminished by the fact that most people will never see it or know about it. The house is full of things made to last. The brass door hardware has been polished so many times that the high points have a deep golden colour and the recesses retain a darker tone, an effect that no manufacturer could replicate and that can only be produced by decades of regular cleaning with the right cloth and the right pressure applied in the right motion. The kitchen implements are old. The cast-iron skillet that Cordelia uses for eggs on Sunday mornings has been in the house since before she was born. It is seasoned with the accumulated residue of 60 years of cooking, which is not grease, but something more complex, something that has become part of the iron itself, and that gives the skillet a quality of cooking that nothing new can match. All of these objects, these rooms, these stairways and shelves and carefully maintained surfaces are part of what the aunts have tended, not as a project or a preservation effort or a statement about the past, as the ordinary, ongoing work of living in a place with full attention and a proper sense of stewardship. The word stewardship is the one Cordelia uses, when she uses any word at all, for the relationship she and Josephine have with the house and everything in it. To be a steward is to hold something in trust for the future without confusing your tenure with ownership. The house will outlast them. They are, for the time being, its keepers. That is enough. The aunts never married. This is the fact that people comment on most often, when they comment at all, which is less often than you might expect. In the social world of mid-century Connecticut, two women of good family who had arrived at their 60s together in the family house were simply themselves. Two women, the house, the trust, the letters. It required no explanation because it had been the case for so long that explanation had become unnecessary, like explaining why a river runs in a particular direction. They had each had in their early lives the experience that their era called prospects. Cordelia had been engaged once, briefly, in 1910, to a man named Harrison Wells, who had some connection to the textile business and who was considered a reasonable match in every way that could be measured. The engagement lasted 4 months. It ended, as Cordelia later described it in a single sentence to Josephine, because she had realised, over the course of several conversations in which Harrison had explained to her his plans for the next 20 years, that the plan had no room in it for anyone but Harrison. She had written him a letter, returned the ring by hand through her father's housekeeper, and resumed her life without visible alteration. She was 24. Josephine's story was different. The man she had meant to marry, Robert Ellsworth, a physician from Northampton, had died not in the war but before it, in a road accident of the sort that the early automobile age produced with relentless frequency. He had been driving himself to a house call in October of 1915, when a wheel gave way on a wet road, and the automobile went into a ditch. He was 31. He had proposed to Josephine 6 weeks earlier. She had accepted. No announcement had been made. When he died, she was, in the eyes of the world, simply a young woman who had lost a friend. Only Cordelia knew differently. Josephine had told her the evening of the proposal, sitting in the back parlour by the fire, with the particular contained joy of someone who has good news and is choosing carefully who to tell first. When Robert died, it was Cordelia she called for first, called for in the middle of the night, called from sleep, and Cordelia had come down the hall in her wrapper and sat with her sister until the morning came, and had not said anything about time healing or God's plan or any of the things that people say because they do not know what else to say. She had simply stayed. That was what Josephine needed. That was what Cordelia provided. The grief was long and private. Josephine attended church and called on neighbours and ate her meals and read her books and wrote her letters, and only in the back parlour, only with Cordelia, was the grief permitted its full dimensions. This took 2 years. Then it contracted, became something smaller and denser and permanent, the kind of sorrow that doesn't end but domesticates, that finds its place in the house of a person's life and agrees to stay there quietly without making unreasonable demands. Neither sister became bitter about their experience. This is important to say because it is not inevitable. Bitterness would have been a reasonable response in both cases, for Cordelia, who had loved a man and found him insufficient, for Josephine, who had loved a man and lost him to no fault of anyone. But bitterness is expensive, and the Alderton sisters, in the way of women who have been trained in the management of limited resources, did not spend on things that would not give them a return. What they gave each other instead was a life, not a consolation prize, a life. A genuine, particular, inhabited life with its own routines and rhythms and pleasures and difficulties, its own small economies and its own genuine satisfactions. Josephine would say, in her older years, that she had not missed having a husband so much as she had, occasionally, missed the idea of a husband. The idea of someone who would be there in the mornings and the evenings and the long middle of ordinary days, who would know your habits and remember your preferences and register your presence in the particular way that intimate familiarity produces. But then, and here her voice would take on the slight dryness that was her version of humour, she had Cordelia for that. And Cordelia, for all her formality, was a far more satisfactory companion than Harrison Wells could ever have been. The family had tried in the early years to arrange new prospects for each of them. Their brothers' wives in particular had felt the responsibility. A cousin of somebody's was produced at a dinner in 1919. An eligible widower was mentioned in 1924. A very pleasant man in land development was introduced at the 4th of July gathering in 1927. Each time, the sisters managed the situation with a skill that looked like warmth while being, in fact, extremely precise deflection. They would speak well of the man, find something genuine to compliment in him, make it clear that they had enjoyed his company, and then ensure by entirely natural-seeming means that no second meeting was arranged. They never said they were not interested. They simply ensured that interest never became occasion. After 1930 or so, the family stopped trying. Something had settled. Perhaps it was the Depression, which reordered everyone's priorities toward more urgent matters. Perhaps it was simply the passage of time and the solidification of a pattern that, once established, became difficult to imagine otherwise. The aunts were the aunts. The house was the house. This was how things were, and in a family that valued, above almost everything else, the reliability of things being as they were supposed to be, this was, in fact, a considerable comfort. What did they have, those 40 years together in the red brick house at the end of the gravel drive? They had winter evenings by the fire when Cordelia read, and Josephine knitted, and neither said anything for an hour because nothing needed to be said. They had spring mornings when the crocuses came up in the garden, and Josephine made note of them with a pleasure she did not try to conceal. They had summers when the nieces and nephews came and the house was full for a week at a time with the noise and energy of younger generations, and then quiet again when they left. A quietness that was not empty but satisfied. They had arguments, because people who know each other completely also know each other's most effective targets. The arguments were not frequent and they were not prolonged. They were conducted at a volume barely above normal conversation, and resolved by the particular mechanism of two people who have argued before and know that the argument will end and that the matter of ending it well is more important than the matter of winning. They had the specific humour of long intimacy, the references that needed no explanation, the shared understanding of a look or a silence, the jokes that were so old they had become simply part of the house's vocabulary. They had the trust and the work of the trust, which was genuine work and took genuine intelligence, and was, for both of them, more satisfying than they would have thought to say aloud. It was satisfying to do something well, to manage something complex and manage it correctly over many years, to watch a family navigate its difficulties with more grace than it would have had otherwise, to know your own hand in that navigation even when no one else knew it. This was not a small satisfaction. In an era when most satisfactions available to women of their class were by design small, this was a substantial one. The question of whether they were happy is perhaps the wrong question. What they were was present. Fully, specifically, intentionally present in their own lives, in this house, in this work, with each other. The presentness of them, the way they inhabited their particular circumstances without constant reference to the circumstances they might have had instead. This was itself a kind of achievement, a kind of answer to a question that most people never quite managed to stop asking. The specific texture of companionship that the sisters had developed was difficult to describe to people outside it. It was not constant conversation. They spent significant portions of each day in separate rooms, engaged in separate activities without communicating. Cordelia in the library and Josephine in the garden, or Cordelia at her correspondence and Josephine reading in the back parlour, each absorbed in her own work for hours at a time. The companionship was not in the talking. It was in the shared ground beneath the talking, the knowledge that in any given moment the other person was in the house, present and available, occupying the same space of time and place. They had, as all long partnerships develop, a private language. Not a code, not anything deliberately constructed, but the natural shorthand of people who have known each other for decades and whose communication has compressed accordingly. A certain look that meant, "I know what you're thinking, and I agree." A particular silence that meant, "This does not need to be said aloud and is therefore better unsaid." The gesture Josephine made with one hand, a slight half-turn of the wrist, that meant something along the lines of, "I see this too, and we will talk about it later when we are not in company." The word Cordelia used for a specific type of family problem, a word she had used since the 1920s that was not quite in common use, but that Josephine understood instantly, without needing to look it up or have it explained. They disagreed about things, not often and not on fundamental matters, but on the things that people who share a life and a set of responsibilities will inevitably disagree on. Whether a particular niece should be encouraged in a direction she was moving that seemed promising to Josephine and premature to Cordelia, whether the house needed the east wing repainted this year or could wait another year, whether the December council meeting should introduce a new agenda item that was going to be controversial or hold it for the June meeting when the family had more time to prepare. These disagreements were handled in the way the sisters handled most things, through conversation, through the patient examination of the reasoning on both sides, through the willingness to be wrong and say so when the evidence pointed that way. Cordelia was wrong more often than she appeared to be, and she knew this. The appearance of certainty that her manner projected was a professional attribute, not a personal one. It was the quality that made her useful in the trust's governance, the quality that the family needed when they needed someone to help them think. In private, with Josephine, she was more uncertain. She raised concerns she was not sure were well-founded. She asked questions she did not know the answers to. She sat with the open ends of things rather than resolving them prematurely, which was a discipline she had been practicing for long enough that it had become natural. Josephine received these open ends the way she received most of what Cordelia brought to her, with the specific quality of attention that does not require resolution, that can sit with a question for as long as the question needs to remain a question. This, finally, was the thing that made their partnership unusual, if unusual is even the right word for something that had simply grown from the particular qualities of the two people involved. It was the capacity to hold difficulty without being overwhelmed by it, to attend to complexity without requiring it to become simple before you could deal with it, to be patient with the parts of life, the parts of the family's life, of each other's lives, of their own lives, that did not resolve neatly and were not going to, and to continue doing the work anyway, in full knowledge of that irresolution, without either bitterness or false peace. There is a thing that people with genuine influence rarely do, which is to announce it. The announcement of power is almost always a sign of its insecurity, a declaration made because the power is new or contested, or requires others to acknowledge it in order to feel real. The aunt's power required none of this. It was old enough to have become simply the nature of things, the way the weight of a stone resting on the ground for long enough becomes indistinguishable from the stone's nature. It is not pressing down, it is simply settled. The language through which the aunts exercised their influence was consequently a language of questions and observations rather than directives. A nephew named Frederick came to the house in 1944 to discuss a business venture he wanted to pursue, a partnership in a small manufacturing concern that was producing components for the war effort, and that he believed would transition, after the war, to peacetime consumer goods. He was 38, intelligent, already somewhat successful on his own terms, and he arrived at the house on Alderton Lane with the specific combination of confidence and anxiety that characterises a man who knows he's going to be evaluated. Cordelia received him in the library. They sat in the 2 chairs by the window and she offered him tea, which he accepted, and he laid out his proposal with the thoroughness of someone who had prepared. He spoke for 20 minutes. Cordelia listened with the kind of attention that feels almost physical, the sense of a mind receiving information and holding it, and turning it slowly to examine all its surfaces. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment in the way that was hers, not uncomfortable, not theatrical, simply the natural pause of a person who takes questions seriously enough to think before answering them. She asked about the other partners, Frederick answered. She asked about the manufacturing facility, where it was, what condition it was in, whether the lease was long-term or short. Frederick answered these too, though his answers were less precise than he would have liked, because he had not thought the facility's condition would be the focus of inquiry. She asked about the transition plan from war production to peacetime production, and what goods specifically were envisioned, and what market research had been done to support those choices. Frederick answered more slowly now, because these were the questions whose answers were less certain. After Frederick had spoken for another 20 minutes in response to these questions, Cordelia said something quiet. She said that the proposal sounded interesting, and that she could see why Frederick found it attractive, but that there was one thing she was uncertain about, which was the third partner, a man Frederick had mentioned briefly at the start, whose background she did not know, and whose role in the venture had not been made very clear. She said this without emphasis. She said it the way you mention something you have simply noticed, as an observation rather than a concern. Frederick went home and looked more carefully at the third partner. What he found took 2 weeks to assemble, because it required conversations with people in Providence who knew the man's previous business history. What he found, at the end of those 2 weeks, was that the third partner had been involved in 2 previous manufacturing ventures, both of which had ended badly for everyone except the third partner, who had, on each occasion, arranged his own exit before the difficulties became public. Frederick withdrew from the venture. The venture proceeded without him, with 2 different partners who had not done the same research. It collapsed in 1947 under circumstances that were exactly what Cordelia's quiet observation had suggested they might be. Frederick wrote Cordelia a letter afterward. It was a formal letter, businesslike in the Alderton tradition, but in the last paragraph he deviated from the form in a way that was unusual for him. He said that he wanted to express his gratitude not only for the specific question she had asked, but for the way she had asked it, as a simple observation without insistence, in a way that left him free to draw his own conclusions. He said that he had thought about that for some time after the visit, and had come to understand that this was a form of respect that he wanted to try to practice himself. Cordelia filed the letter in Frederick's folder. She also, in the margin of her own notes from the meeting, wrote one sentence. F learns. This was, in the Alderton aunt's private shorthand, a significant notation. Not all of them did. The family members who learned, who could receive a question as a question rather than an attack, who could sit with uncertainty about their own plans and let it produce revision rather than defensiveness, these were the ones the aunts invested in most actively, not financially necessarily, though sometimes that too, but in attention, in the particular quality of engagement that Cordelia brought to her correspondence and Josephine brought to her conversations, a quality that felt like faith, like being taken seriously, and that was, for those who received it, a genuine and lasting benefit. The ones who did not learn were handled differently, not unkindly, never unkindly. The aunts did not punish or exclude or favour in ways that were visible, but the level of engagement changed. A nephew who consistently ignored the aunt's questions and pursued whatever he'd been going to pursue anyway received, over time, correspondence that was slightly more formal, slightly more limited in its investment. The aunts would fulfil their obligations to him, the trust, the family council, the proper observances. But the extra dimension of attention, the personal investment that made their correspondence valuable, simply did not appear. Most of the time he didn't notice. Occasionally he did, and came to the house wondering what had changed, and the aunts would receive him warmly and explain nothing, and he would leave having been well treated and somehow still slightly diminished. Josephine's method in conversation had a parallel quality. She gave her full attention to the people who could use it. With others, the ones who were performing rather than thinking, who were seeking validation rather than guidance, she remained pleasant and entirely present in manner, but the particular light of her engagement, that quality of being genuinely interested in what you were saying because she was genuinely interested in what you were thinking, this she withheld. Or not withheld exactly, reserved, saved for where it would do real good. This was not calculation in the cold sense. It was the natural economy of people who have limited resources and considerable demands on them, and who have learned, through long experience, where their investment produces the best return. A farmer does not plant seeds in soil that will not grow them. This is not cruelty to the soil. It is simply knowledge. The knowledge that the aunts had accumulated over 40 years was very precise. They knew their family the way an experienced physician knows a patient whose case history they have followed for decades, not through any single examination but through the long continuity of attention, the pattern visible only to the observer who's been watching long enough to see it. They knew which nieces had their grandfather's stubbornness, which nephews had their father's specific weakness for plausible-sounding schemes, which children were going to be all right regardless of what happened, and which ones needed specific targeted support at specific moments to arrive at all right on the other side. This knowledge was exercised quietly. It rarely named itself. It expressed itself in a letter arriving at the right moment, in a question asked before a decision was finalized, in a visit suggested for a weekend when someone was going to need, though they did not yet know it, to be somewhere that felt stable and certain and old. The house on Alderton Lane was always open. The kettle was always ready. The back parlour chairs faced each other across the Persian rug, waiting as they had always waited for whoever needed them next. The influence the aunts had on the family's marriage decisions was the most often discussed in later years of all the dimensions of their governance. It was also the most misunderstood. People imagined, when they imagined it, a more direct intervention than the reality offered. They imagined vetoes, prohibitions, meetings at which potential spouses were evaluated and pronounced upon. None of this happened. What happened was more like weather. The aunts created a climate in which certain things grew naturally and other things did not. The climate was produced by questions. Cordelia's letters to family members who were considering marriages asked questions that forced a specific kind of reflection. Not about the prospective spouse primarily, about the person asking. What do you want your life to look like in 20 years? What are the things you will need in a companion that a companion might not know to offer unless asked for? What have you learned from watching the marriages in this family about what sustains and what erodes? These questions were gentle. They were asked with genuine curiosity and without judgment, and they had the effect, consistently, of making people think more carefully about what they actually wanted before they made a choice that would shape everything else. The marriages that the aunts were concerned about were not the ones that seemed glamorous or exciting or that the family was enthusiastic about. Those took care of themselves one way or another. The marriages that concerned the aunts were the ones that seemed sensible and adequate, and that were therefore undertaken without sufficient examination of whether sensible and adequate were what the person actually needed. A marriage made out of convenience, or out of the pressure of turning 30 without a clear alternative, or out of the exhaustion of searching and wanting to stop. These marriages, in the aunt's long observation, tended to produce a specific kind of misery. Not dramatic misery. The subtle, leeching misery of having made a choice before you understood what you were choosing. They had seen this in the family. Theodore had made exactly such a marriage, to a perfectly acceptable woman whom he had married because it was time and she was available and the family approved. The marriage had produced 3 children and 40 years of mutual accommodation, and the specific sadness of 2 people who had lived together long enough to know each other's limitations without ever having known each other's depths. Neither had done anything wrong. Neither was unkind. They had simply chosen each of them before they fully knew what they needed, and the choice had been irrevocable. and they had lived inside it for the rest of their lives. Cordelia had seen this marriage from the inside of the family for 40 years. She had drawn from it the conclusion that the question of whom to marry deserved as much careful thought as any other significant decision, and more than most, because its consequences extended across decades and because it could not be undone without damage. She had not said this to Theodore, because it had not been her business to say it to Theodore, and because saying it would not have changed anything. She said it in her letter-writing way to the family members who came after, who were still young enough that the message could be received before the choice was made. The garden behind the house on Alderton Lane is not a formal garden. It is not the kind of garden that appears in magazines or that people travel to see. It is a working garden, a domestic garden, the kind that has developed organically over many decades of practical use and aesthetic preference, and the specific influence of two women who had, between them, a complete range of opinion about what a garden should contain. Cordelia prefers order. Her section of the garden, the north bed, against the stone wall, is planted in straight rows with generous spacing between plants, each species given exactly as much room as it needs, and not a square inch more. Tomatoes staked with precision, beans on a trellis of her own construction, built from chestnut stakes cut from the property's back woodlot and strung with cotton twine that she replaces each spring. The north bed looks, from a distance, like a very small version of something planned, an estate garden's kitchen plot, miniaturized and made domestic. Josephine's section is the south bed, and it is different in almost every respect. She plants by instinct and impulse, moving things around from year to year, trying a new variety of lettuce or a different configuration of herbs, allowing the garden to be in part a conversation rather than a declaration. Her rows are rows, but they have the slight irregularity of something that was planted on a morning when the light was good and the soil was cooperative and she was thinking about something else. The result is a bed that feels inhabited rather than managed, a garden you would sit beside rather than stand before. Mrs. Pratt tends both sections without playing favourites, which is itself a form of diplomacy. She weeds and waters and stakes and harvests with the equal attention she brings to everything in the house. She has her own opinions about the garden. She would, if consulted, say that the south bed's irregularity makes the weeding harder. But she does not volunteer these opinions. This is the most valuable thing about Mrs. Pratt, and the sisters know it and have, over the years, found small ways to acknowledge it. The raise she received in 1940 without asking, the half-day she was given on Fridays beginning in 1947, when her mother's health required it, the particular quality of a warm welcome she received whenever she arrived at the back door on Tuesday mornings, as if her presence were genuinely anticipated and not merely expected. The garden runs through the calendar with a rhythm that is different from the house's rhythm but complementary to it. The house is stable, consistent, its rhythms driven by the clock and the letter and the Tuesday-Thursday schedule of Mrs. Pratt's visits. The garden changes. It is a record of seasons, of temperatures, of the particular rainfall in any given year, and the particular earliness or lateness of spring. It keeps its own time, and the sisters attend to that time alongside the time they keep inside. In March, if the snow has receded by mid-month, Cordelia walks the north bed and takes stock. The garlic she put in last October is already showing. Thin green tips pushing through the cold soil with the specific determination of things that have been underground long enough and have decided to surface. She notes what made it through the winter and what didn't. She has kept this record in a garden notebook since 1924, and the notebook, now thickened with 30 years of entries in slightly varying inks, sits on the bottom shelf of the library alongside the household account books. Someone looking through these records would understand, from the variety and the precision, that this was not casual gardening. This was a sustained inquiry into the behaviour of plants in a specific piece of Connecticut ground. April is Josephine's month. She comes out in the morning with her trowel and her seed packets and begins the long conversation with the south bed about what will go where this year. The packets spread across the potting bench on the garden's south wall carry their small excitements. New varieties tried on the recommendation of a catalogue, old favourites returned to after an experimental year with something else. Josephine reads seed catalogues with the same attentiveness she brings to novels, looking for the character of a plant in the language of its description, trying to determine whether it will do what it claims to do, or whether it is overselling itself, as so many things do. By May, the garden is in full preparation. This is the month when it smells most complicated. The cold earth warming, the first herbs releasing their oils in the morning heat, the particular clean smell of water on dry soil. The sisters take their morning tea in the garden in May, if the weather permits, sitting on the stone bench at the garden's centre that their father had installed in 1902, and that has been developing a satisfying incrustation of lichen ever since. The bench faces south. In May, the morning light comes from the east at a shallow angle and catches the garden at its best. Everything still new, the proportions not yet established, the whole season still in front of it. June and July are the months of work. Mrs. Pratt is in the garden Thursday afternoons. Cordelia picks in the mornings before the heat builds. Josephine inspects in the evenings, standing at the south bed's edge in her housecoat, evaluating and making notes in the small notebook she carries in her left pocket. The kitchen fills with the business of a productive garden. Jars for preserving, the water bath canner that lives on the bottom shelf of the pantry, the particular smell of hot vinegar that means pickles are being made. August is the fullness. Everything that was a seed in April is now itself completely. The tomatoes as large as they will get, the beans producing faster than can comfortably be used, the basil so abundant that it goes into everything. This abundance is not taken for granted. Cordelia has lived through the Depression and through rationing, and she has a Depression-era relationship with plenty. It is to be acknowledged with genuine gratitude, used carefully, and stored against the future. The preserving in August is not a hobby. It is still, in some ancestral part of her understanding, a necessary act of provision. September is the close. The nights cool and the garden begins its withdrawal, the leaves of the tomato plants yellowing from the bottom up, the bean vines drying on their trellises. Cordelia brings in the remaining tomatoes before the first frost and lines them on the window sills of the back parlour. The green ones that will ripen slowly inside, the red ones that will be eaten fresh over the coming days. The smell of these tomatoes ripening on a windowsill in September is one of the specific smells of this house in this season, and it is the smell that returning family members are always struck by first when they come for a Thanksgiving visit, and find it still faintly present in the air. The garden in October is almost bare. The stone wall of the north bed is visible now without the summer's greenery. The potting bench is cleared and covered. The stakes are pulled and stored in the woodshed. What remains is the garlic going in for another winter, and the perennial herbs that will come back next spring without being asked. The thyme and the sage and the old rosemary bush in the corner that Josephine has been tending since 1931, and that is now so large and woody at its base that it looks like a small grey-green tree. November, December, January, February. The garden sleeps. Or not quite sleeps. It continues below the surface in the way that things continue below the surface of winter. Bulbs generating, roots persisting. The garlic in its quiet progress. The garden does not need to be visible to be present. It is there in the jars of preserved tomatoes on the pantry shelves, in the dried herbs on the kitchen hooks, in the soil that is, at this moment, resting and composting and preparing to be asked again, in March, to do what it has done for decades. The sisters understand this rhythm the way they understand the house's rhythm, from inside it, not from outside. They are not observers of their own life. They are its inhabitants. The garden grows for them, and they tend it, and the years pile up behind them with the quiet abundance of a well-kept place, of a life that has been, season after season, faithfully attended. The bees arrived in the garden in 1936, when Josephine set out 3 hives along the south wall at the suggestion of a neighbour who kept bees and who said that the garden's production would improve. The neighbour was right. The tomatoes in the years after the hives arrived were measurably and observably better than the tomatoes before. Josephine tends the hives herself. She had to learn from the neighbour. Several evenings of instruction, the proper equipment, the proper movements that signal to the bees that you are a known presence and not a threat. She has tended them every year since, without complaint, in the summer heat, and in the particular risk of autumn harvesting when the bees are at their most defensive. She has been stung a number of times. She considers this a reasonable cost for the honey and the tomatoes and the specific quality of attention that the bees require, which is a quality of slowness and predictability that she finds, in her private accounting, genuinely good for her. The honey from the Alderton hives is pale gold in spring, darker and more complex in late summer when the bees have been working the goldenrod and the asters in the fields beyond the property line. Josephine puts it up in small glass jars, 6 or 8 jars per harvest, and keeps some and gives the rest away to the people she feels deserve it, which is a category she determines by a logic she has never articulated. Mrs. Pratt receives a jar each autumn. The minister at the Congregational Church receives one. The lawyer in New Haven receives one, though whether this is affection or maintenance of a relationship that has been productive for 40 years is a distinction Josephine does not make. The garden in winter, when the soil is frozen and the hives are sealed against the cold and the stone bench is too cold to sit on, is not nothing. It is not a nothing place in a nothing season. The structure of it remains, the bones of the thing, and these bones are worth attending to in their own way. Cordelia walks through it on mild January afternoons, noting what the frost has done and not done, observing the garlic tips if they are visible, checking the mulch over the perennial beds. She carries her garden notebook and sometimes writes in it, and sometimes simply stands in the north bed with her hands in her coat pockets and looks at the wall and the empty stakes and the grey January sky above the house. And this standing, this attending without doing, is its own form of care. What grows and dies and grows again in the garden is a version of everything else in the house, the patience of it, the long game of it. A fruit tree planted in 1932 takes 5 years to produce seriously. Perennials planted in 1935 are still flowering in 1953. The stone wall of the north bed, built by Cordelia's father sometime in the 1880s, holds the warmth of summer afternoons into the September evenings. These timescales are different from the timescale of a single life. They are the timescale of a place. The sisters have been in the place long enough to work in its timescale rather than fighting against it. This is perhaps the most significant thing the house has given them, a sense of time that is longer than a single life, and that makes a single life feel not smaller, but better positioned. Twice a year, the family formal council convened, once in June, once in December. The June meeting was held outdoors if the weather cooperated, on the back terrace, with a table brought from the dining room and covered in a white cloth and set with the good china. The December meeting was inside in the dining room, which was aired out and prepared for the occasion by Mrs. Pratt in the day before. The long table extended to its full length, the silver candlesticks from the sideboard placed at intervals along its centre. These meetings were the formal face of an informal governance that operated continuously throughout the year. They served several functions at once. They were where the trust's accounts were reviewed. Not in detail, the lawyers had done that already, and the relevant pages were distributed beforehand, but in the kind of unhurried overview that allowed the family to understand its own position, rather than merely being informed of it. They were where major decisions were made, whether to sell the Vermont timberland or a portion of it, whether to lend from the family reserve to a member who needed help, whether a property required significant maintenance that should come from the trust's capital account rather than its income. And they were where the family was each June and December, reminded that it was a family. That reminder was itself a function of the gathering, performed not through speeches or stated purpose, but through the simple reality of being in the same room for a day. The cousins who had not seen each other since the previous Christmas, the siblings who had exchanged letters but not visits, the children of those siblings who arrived each year a little larger, a little more themselves, carrying their parents' features in new proportions. Cordelia ran the formal business of the meetings. She had an agenda, typed on cream paper and distributed at the start. She kept notes in the same format as always, the backward-leaning hand-recording decisions and deferred items and the names of who had said what on which side. Her authority in these meetings was unambiguous without being asserted. She did not raise her voice. She did not use the kind of parliamentary language that some chairmen use to signal their control of a room. She simply knew what needed to be covered, in what order, and with what degree of care, and she managed the agenda the way she managed everything, with precise attention to what mattered and patient disregard for what did not. Josephine's role in the meetings was different and more subtle. She sat to Cordelia's left and said less, but what she said tended to arrive at moments of particular weight, when a discussion was going in a direction that felt unproductive, when a family member was talking in a way that was more about emotion than about the matter at hand, when a decision was being rushed that deserved more consideration. Her interventions were always phrased as questions, Have we considered what happens if the timber market softens before the sale is complete? Is there a reason we need to decide today, or would another month give us more to go on? These were the questions that reset the room's temperature. That moved it from urgency to deliberation. The aunts between them had, in 40 years, learned to play together the way an experienced pair of musicians play together, each knowing when to lead and when to follow. The December meeting ran into the afternoon and was followed by dinner, which was itself a production. Mrs. Pratt came in for the full day to prepare it. The roast that had been the December dinner since Harlan Alderton's time, the potatoes in 2 preparations because the family had never agreed on a single one, the green beans from the summer's preserving, the cranberry sauce that Josephine made herself every November from fresh cranberries and orange zest, and a measure of port that she was vague about if anyone asked. The table held everyone who had attended the meeting, plus spouses and any children of appropriate age, and the formality of the afternoon dissolved into the informality of a family at dinner, which is its own species of chaos. The competing conversations, the children being managed, the passing of dishes, the specific sounds of a large group eating together in a heated room. Cordelia sat at the head of the table. She always sat at the head of the table. The house was hers, or rather it was both of theirs, held jointly, though in formal documents Cordelia was listed first, and no one had ever suggested a different arrangement. She served the roast herself, carving with the same bone-handled knife that her father had used, slicing with the care of someone for whom the act of carving is not a performance, but a simple demonstration of competence. The slices were even. They always were. Josephine sat at the other end. Between them the family arranged itself by some combination of preference and tradition. Certain nephews who always sat in the same chairs, a niece who for years had sat beside Josephine and absorbed a great deal of practical wisdom between the potatoes and the dessert. Children at the side table, which was set with the almost good china rather than the very good china, and which had its own kind of formality, being the place where Alderton children had eaten since before any of the adults now at the long table could remember. After dinner, the family moved to the front and back parlours, depending on preference. The fire was lit in both. The children were allowed the considerable privilege of the library for the evening, with its bookshelves and the large desk that could be cleared to make a surface for games. The adults settled into the particular looseness of people who have eaten a substantial dinner and who have nothing pressing to do for the remainder of the evening. Here, over the brandy or the tea or the second glass of wine, the conversations that the formal meeting had not accommodated were had. The personal ones, the ones that were not on the agenda. The aunts moved between rooms. They were guests at their own dinner in a sense, or hosts who had relinquished hostship for the evening and were now simply present, available, the fixed points around which the family's social orbit arranged itself. A nephew would find himself talking to Cordelia in the library doorway. A niece would end up beside Josephine on the back parlour settee. These conversations were not arranged. They were what happened when you put a family in a room and removed the formal agenda. Later in the evening, after the children had been gathered and the goodnights had been said and the last cars had backed out down the gravel drive, the house returned to the sisters. They moved through it with the quiet efficiency of long practice. The lamps extinguished, the fire screened, the dishes of the day accounted for and left for Mrs. Pratt in the morning. These were the small domestic rituals of closing a household for the night, performed so many thousands of times that they had become automatic, a kind of physical grammar of the house's habitual life. Cordelia would go to the library for a final half hour, reviewing her notes from the meeting, making any additions that the day's discussion had prompted. Josephine would go to the back parlour with a book, though she rarely read much at this hour. More often she sat with the book open and thought about the day, turning the conversations over in her mind in that way she had, examining them from the various angles available to someone who is not a participant in the moment, but who thinks about it afterward. When the clock struck 11 or 12, they went upstairs. The house fell quiet around them. The December wind was outside and the house held its warmth against it, the old bricks of the walls retaining the day's heat and releasing it slowly through the night. The clock in the parlour ticked. The house breathed. In the rooms above the garden and the gravel drive and the iron gate, two sisters lay in their beds reading or not reading, each in her room with its own light, together in the way that people who have shared a house for 4 decades are together even when they are in separate rooms, continuously, without needing to confirm it, present to each other in the way that the oldest familiar things are present. The dinner table in December was the place where the year was completed. Not the meeting, which completed the formal year of the trust. Not the Christmas morning, which completed the year in its religious dimension. The dinner table on the evening of the December council meeting, with the family gathered and the candles lit, and Mrs. Pratt's roast on the sideboard, and the particular noise and warmth of people who have spent the day in serious discussion, and are now permitted to lay it down and simply be together. This was the completion. This was the year becoming what it was going to be, settling into its final form before the new one began. Cordelia carved and Josephine oversaw the table from her end, and the family sorted itself out in the way it always did, the cousins finding their cousins and the children finding the side table, and the in-laws finding their respective positions among the brothers and sisters, and the whole complicated organism of a large family at dinner, organising itself with the specific efficiency of a system that has been running long enough to be self-organising. You could watch this from the doorway and see the order emerge from what looked like chaos, the way a murmuration of starlings appears chaotic until you have watched it long enough to see the underlying pattern. The conversations at the December dinner were different from the conversations at the June meeting. The June meeting was held in the relatively long days of early summer, outdoors if possible, with a quality of openness and possibility that the season provided. The December dinner was held in the dark. The candles were the primary light. Outside the dining room windows the Connecticut night was deep and cold, and the old oaks were bare, and the gravel drive was silver with frost. Inside was warmth and food and wine and the particular consolation of being together in the dark season, which is a consolation that all old winter celebrations are organised around, whatever their specific occasion. The children ate at the side table with the specific excited gravity of children who understand they are permitted to be present at an adult occasion, and who are performing, for the benefit of the adults who glance at them, a version of good behaviour that is slightly more formal than their usual. They ate their food, they spoke in lower voices than usual, they observed the adult table with the peripheral attention of children trying to understand a world that is not yet fully available to them. Some of what they observed would stay with them for decades. The specific way their grandmother moved the salt cellar, the sound of a particular laugh from across the table, the quality of candlelight on the older faces, the sense that this room and these people were something more than the sum of their parts. After dinner, in the parlours, the day's formality was finally set down. People sat without arranging themselves correctly. Someone's shoes came off. A child was allowed to sit on the floor beside the fire. The conversation ceased to be about anything in particular, and became instead the ambient communication of people who are simply together, the background noise of a family at rest. Cordelia sat in her usual chair in the front parlour and said very little, which was typical of her in social situations that did not require her professional self. She listened. She watched. She held the room in the way that people who have been holding rooms for a long time hold them, from the inside out, from the specific quality of their presence rather than through any action. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The Alderton Trust was not complicated as trusts of its era went. It held the house and its surrounding 8 acres, the Vermont timberland, 240 acres of mixed hardwood and softwood that had been acquired in 1887 and that produced income from selective harvesting, a portfolio of bonds and equities managed by the firm in New Haven, and a reserve account that accumulated income not otherwise distributed, and that was drawn upon for major expenditures, significant repairs to the house, loans to family members, property taxes, and the occasional capital investment that the Advisory Council judged worthwhile. The income from this trust, divided according to the document's provisions among the surviving Alderton siblings and their descendants, was not a large income by any standard except the standard of comfortable, modest living in mid-century Connecticut. It was enough to maintain the house. It was enough for Cordelia and Josephine to live as they lived. The Tuesday-Thursday arrangement with Mrs. Pratt. The good furniture maintained rather than replaced. The reliable tea and the reasonable clothing and the subscriptions to the periodicals they actually read. It was enough with care for the family to hold together across generations without dispersing into the anonymity of ordinary financial life. The care required was significant and ongoing. Harlan Alderton had been a capable man who had built the trust's assets through a combination of patience and judgment, but he had not been exceptional. The trust's assets in 1917, when he died, represented the product of 40 years of reasonable decisions. By 1953, when this story takes its setting, the trust's assets had grown, not dramatically, not in the manner of the great fortunes that appeared in newspaper headlines, but solidly and without interruption, which is, in the understanding of people who manage things over the long term, the only kind of growth worth having. That growth was Cordelia's doing, primarily. Not in the sense that she had made brilliant investments. She had not. She was not a speculator and did not aspire to be. She had grown it through two things: the disciplined avoidance of bad decisions, which is underrated as a financial strategy, and the careful management of income that ensured that more came in each year than went out. The first of these had required, over 40 years, the quiet exercise of a veto over a number of proposals from family members whose enthusiasm outran their judgment. The second had required the kind of constant, meticulous attention to detail that only someone with genuine patience for detail can sustain over decades without losing accuracy. In 1929, when the markets collapsed, the Alderton Trust lost 30% of its equity value. This was painful, but it was considerably less than the losses sustained by trusts that had been more aggressively invested, which Cordelia had resisted in the preceding years despite some pressure from the lawyers who managed the portfolio. The lawyers had argued for a larger equity position when the markets were rising. Cordelia had demurred, in her way, not refusing outright, but asking questions that the lawyers found difficult to answer about what would happen to the trust's income obligations if the equities declined, and how long it might take to recover, and whether the family had sufficient reserves to weather an extended period of reduced income. The lawyers answered these questions as well as they could, which was imperfectly. Cordelia filed their answers and continued to demur. After 1929, no one argued with Cordelia's investment preferences again. The trust's position, conservative, income-oriented, with the Vermont timberland as a tangible asset providing consistent yield through all markets, was vindicated in the most thorough way possible, which is to say that when everything else went badly, it performed adequately. The family members who had been impatient with Cordelia's caution in the late 20s were, by 1932, vocally grateful. She accepted their gratitude in the way she accepted most things, with brevity, with no particular emphasis on having been right, and with an immediate pivot to the next item on the agenda. Josephine's contribution to the trust's management was less quantifiable but not less real. She was the one who managed the relationships, with the lawyers, with the bank officers, with the occasional property manager who handled the Vermont timberlands harvesting contracts. She attended to these relationships with the same quality of attention she brought to family members: genuine interest, good questions, the specific warmth of someone who remembers details about your life and asks about them at appropriate intervals. The lawyers in New Haven had been at the firm for a long time. They had seen the Alderton Trust through 3 generations. They had, over the years, a number of opportunities to recommend financial products that would have benefited the firm more than the trust. They consistently declined to do so. Whether this was because they were unusually ethical, or because Josephine Alderton had, over 30 years, made them feel that her family's trust was a personal relationship rather than a financial account, was a question they probably could not have answered cleanly. The Vermont timberland deserved its own consideration. Cordelia had been to Vermont once in 1931 to inspect the property and meet the manager who handled the harvesting contracts. She had not been back. The property existed for her primarily as a figure in the trust's accounts: the annual income from selective timber sales, the property tax, the manager's fee. And she tracked these figures with the same regularity she tracked everything else. But she had, from that single visit in 1931, a visual memory of the property that she returned to occasionally when the accounts came in. The specific quality of Vermont light in October, the smell of cut wood in the morning, the particular sound of a forest that has been managed carefully over a long period and that knows, in whatever way a forest knows anything, that it is being attended to. She had never described this memory to Josephine. Some things in the house were kept private, not out of secrecy, but out of the natural reticence of two people who had lived together long enough to understand that privacy was not the opposite of intimacy, but its necessary companion. Josephine had her own private thoughts, her own memories she kept for herself. Robert Ellsworth's face, for example. She had not described it to anyone in many years, and the act of keeping it private had, over time, made it hers in a way it would not have been had she shared it freely. The trust meeting each December was the moment when all of this, the accounts, the properties, the loans and gifts and management decisions of the preceding year, was assembled into a single document and laid before the family in the form of Cordelia's summary report. 4 pages, typed by Cordelia herself on the typewriter in the library corner that she had bought in 1935, and that produced a slightly uneven line of type that was recognizable as hers the way handwriting is recognizable. The report covered income and expenditure, the status of all properties, any changes to the portfolio, and the anticipated needs of the coming year. The family received these reports with a range of attention. Some read them thoroughly and came to the December meeting with questions. Others glanced at the summary page and trusted the aunts to have handled everything correctly, which was a trust that the aunts had never in 40 years violated, and which therefore continued to be well placed. A few of the younger generation, in the 50s, began to show the particular form of inattention that comes from growing up comfortable, the inattention of people for whom security has been so consistent that they cannot fully imagine its absence. Cordelia noticed this and was troubled by it in a way she was not always troubled by the family's various shortcomings. The shortcomings she'd observed over 40 years were mostly specific to individuals, a tendency toward bad investments here, a romantic judgment problem there. The inattention of the younger generation seemed more systemic. It seemed to her that comfort, sustained over multiple generations, produced something she could only call softness. Not moral softness, not unkindness, but the intellectual and practical softness of people who have never been required to be tough. The trust had been built to protect the family from difficulty. She had begun to wonder whether in doing so it had also protected them from the kind of difficulty that makes people capable. She mentioned this to Josephine one evening, not as a problem with a solution but as an observation to be held. Josephine listened and was quiet for a moment, and then said that she thought the family's next challenge was going to be exactly this, that the generation coming up would need to learn what their parents had known and their grandparents had known, but that they would need to learn it without the external pressures that had made the learning necessary for earlier generations. They would need to choose difficulty in a sense, or find some substitute for it. Cordelia had written this down in her notes afterward, not attributing it to Josephine, just noting it as a thought worth keeping. She returned to it periodically in the following years. She did not arrive at a solution. The thought remained in her notes, waiting, the way the best thoughts always wait, for the right moment to become useful. The Vermont timberland was, in a practical sense, the most reliable asset the trust held. The house was an asset of a different kind, primarily a cost in terms of maintenance and taxes, though it produced the intangible benefit of being the family's physical centre, and therefore justified its costs on grounds that did not appear in any financial statement. The bonds and equities in the New Haven portfolio were subject to the markets, which Cordelia managed conservatively but could not control. But the timberland simply grew. Year after year the trees added their increments of height and girth, and the selective harvesting removed the timber that was ready to be removed and left the rest to continue growing. And the income from this process arrived with the regularity of something that is not subject to human error, but only to the long, patient math of forest growth. Cordelia had once, in a letter to the lawyers in New Haven in 1935, described the timberland as the trust's conscience. She had meant this in a specific sense. It was the asset that reminded her, when she was making decisions about the rest of the portfolio, that the right timescale for managing wealth is the timescale of growth, and not the timescale of markets. Markets moved daily, quarterly, annually. A tree grew over decades. The timberland's annual income was modest, but it was the income of something that was also, simultaneously, becoming more valuable because it was being well maintained. And this double quality of present income and future value was exactly what Cordelia wanted the family to understand about its own situation. She had tried to explain this to the family in various ways over the years, without using the word conscience, which would have seemed grandiose. What she had said in the clearest version of the argument she had ever made at the December meeting of 1938 was that the trust's purpose was not to produce maximum income in any given year, but to maintain and improve the family's position over the lifetime of every family member who would depend on it. That these were different objectives and that maximizing the first one frequently came at the expense of the second. that a trust managed for its beneficiaries over multiple generations looked very different from a portfolio managed for its owner in the present, and that the timberland, which had been growing and generating income since before she was born, and which would continue to do so after she was gone, was the clearest illustration she could offer of what multi-generational management actually meant when you carried it out to its full implications. The family had listened to this with varying degrees of comprehension. The family members who were already inclined toward patience understood it immediately and found it clarifying. The family members who were inclined toward urgency heard it and agreed, and then continued doing what they had been doing, which was managing their own finances with a different objective than the one Cordelia described. This did not particularly distress her. She could not change the fundamental orientations of people who had them by inheritance as much as by experience. What she could do was ensure that the trust itself was managed according to the right objective, so that its resources would be available to the family members whose own resources fell short, now and in future generations, as they inevitably would. Among the family's younger generation, there was always a divide between those who remained in the Connecticut River Valley and those who left for cities, for New York, for Boston, for the post-war expansion into the suburbs of Hartford and New Haven, and further afield. The ones who left were not lost to the family. They returned for the council meetings and the holidays and the particular occasions that required everyone's presence. But they left in the way that children of prosperous families have always left, moving toward opportunities the original place couldn't offer, trading the gravity of home for the possibilities of elsewhere. The ones who stayed were a different matter. They were the ones the aunts knew most precisely, knew their daily circumstances, knew which friendships were lasting and which were convenient, knew the texture of their ordinary lives in a way that only proximity allows. The aunts were not intrusive in these relationships. They did not appear unannounced or expect to be included in things that were not their business. But their presence in the valley, the house on Alderton Lane visible from certain roads, the family name on the trust documents, the aunts themselves available on any afternoon to anyone who drove up the gravel drive, this presence shaped things. It set a standard, or a standard adjacent to it, a quality of expectation. There was a niece named Charlotte. She was the daughter of the second oldest brother, Henry, who had stayed in the valley and worked in agriculture supply, a business he had inherited from an uncle on his mother's side, and that he managed with solid competence and without ambition beyond a certain point, which was a comfortable point, and one he occupied contentedly for 30 years. Charlotte grew up knowing the aunts well. She had spent part of each summer at the house on Alderton Lane since she was small, helping in the garden, sitting in the library with permission to take down any book she found interesting. She was a reader, which Cordelia noticed early and approved of quietly. Charlotte came to the house for a longer stay in the summer of 1948. She was 21 and had recently declined a teaching position in Springfield, Massachusetts, in favor of staying in the valley. Her parents were slightly puzzled by this decision. The position in Springfield had seemed to them an obvious opportunity, the kind that should be taken. Charlotte had reasons she did not fully articulate to them, but that came out slowly, over the course of several long evenings in the back parlour to Josephine. What Charlotte said eventually was that she was afraid of what leaving would mean. Not in the abstract. She wasn't afraid of cities or of strangers, or of starting over in an unfamiliar place. She was afraid of what she would become if she left. She had, she said, a tendency to want things too much, to be shaped by her surroundings rather than shaping them. She was afraid that if she went to Springfield, she would become someone Springfield expected her to be rather than someone she had chosen to be. She wanted to be. And here she paused for a long time, long enough that Josephine did not fill the pause, just let it breathe. She wanted to be someone specific, with specific commitments, specific to a place and a set of people. Josephine received this. She did not immediately respond. She poured more tea. She asked Charlotte what specific meant when Charlotte used it. Charlotte thought about this and said, permanent, maybe. Chosen in a way that means something, because you didn't have to choose it. You could have done otherwise. Josephine said, after a further pause, that she understood this, that she and Cordelia had made a version of this choice, not identically, not under the same circumstances, but similarly oriented. The choice to stay in a particular place and tend it rather than go elsewhere and start fresh. She said she would not tell Charlotte whether it was the right choice. That depended on what Charlotte actually wanted, and what Charlotte actually wanted was something only Charlotte could eventually know. But she said that she did not believe the fear Charlotte described was itself a disqualification. That fear about the right thing was different from fear of the wrong thing. Charlotte stayed in the valley. She taught at the local school for 2 years, then moved to the county library system, eventually becoming the head of the children's department at the main branch in the county seat. She was in this position for 23 years. She married a man who worked in land surveying, and who was, by all accounts that reached the aunts, a companionable and steady person. The kind of man who knows where things are and can find them. They had 2 children. Charlotte visited the house on Alderton Lane every month until the aunts were too old to receive monthly visitors, and she was one of the people who, in the final years, managed the logistics of their care with the particular competence of someone who had been paying close attention for a very long time. Among the nephews who left, the most interesting case was a boy named Philip, who was the youngest child of the eldest brother, and who had from an early age the quality of belonging elsewhere. He was quick-minded and restless, and slightly impatient with the pace of things in the valley, a pace that was not slow in any absolute sense, but that felt slow to someone whose thoughts moved at a different speed. He left for New York in 1942, at 20, ostensibly for the war effort, though he ended up in the Washington offices of an agency that needed people who could process and analyze large volumes of information quickly. After the war, he stayed in Washington. He went into law, then into government, and by the time he was 40, he was a person of some modest distinction, in a world that the aunts followed from a great distance through the newspapers and Philip's occasional letters. Philip's letters were different from the other family's letters. They were shorter, more tightly written, with a quality of compression, as if a great deal was being said in very little space, which in fact it was. He was economical with words the way people are when they have learned to think in categories and summaries, rather than in the full texture of things. Cordelia appreciated this. She also noticed what it left out: the domestic, the personal, the texture of daily life that his letters never contained. She knew Philip the way you know a river from a map, the course, the major tributaries, the destination, but not the way you know a river from standing beside it for a long time. He came back to the house at intervals that grew longer as his career demanded more of him. The last time the aunts saw him at their healthiest was 1956, when he came for a December council meeting and stayed for a weekend, and Cordelia had a conversation with him in the library on the Saturday morning that she later described to Josephine as the best conversation she'd had in some years. He was sharp and curious, and had been thinking about things, about the way institutions work, about the gap between formal authority and actual influence, about the long-term effects of short-term decisions, that Cordelia had been thinking about herself in the context of the trust. The conversation ran until lunch. It had the quality for Cordelia of talking to someone who inhabited the same kind of mind, oriented toward the structural, the systemic, the question of how things actually function beneath their formal surfaces. He sent flowers when Josephine died in 1964. He came for the service. He stayed one night in the house and walked through its rooms with the specific attention of someone returning to something they had not expected to miss. He stood in the back parlour for a long time, not speaking, and Cordelia understood this and left him to it. Before he left, he said something to Cordelia that she thought about for the rest of her life. He said that he had always assumed, when he was young, that the aunt's influence on the family was a kind of luck, the good fortune of having 2 intelligent women in a position to help. But he had come to understand, he said, that it was much more than luck. It was the result of 40 years of doing the same thing consistently, well, without requiring recognition for it. It was a form of devotion that he had never managed and had always admired. Cordelia thanked him for saying so. She said in return that she had always believed Philip was the most purely intelligent of the family's next generation, that his mind was genuinely first-rate. She said she hoped he knew that. He said he didn't actually always know that the life he'd built involved a level of performance that made self-knowledge difficult, because you could never quite determine whether what you were doing was real or whether it was very good imitation. She said she understood that difficulty. She said that the advantage of staying in one place for 40 years was that there was very little room for performance. The house and the garden and Mrs. Pratt and the family did not require you to perform. They required you to show up reliably and do the actual thing. Philip said he envied that. Cordelia said he shouldn't, that the grass of other pastures had specific qualities that were genuinely their own and that deserved to be valued on their own terms. Philip said she was still the same as she had always been. She took this as the compliment she understood him to mean. Families learn in the way that rivers learn, not through single dramatic events, though those happen, but through the accumulation of small corrections over long periods. A river shifts its channel by a fraction each year, responding to the resistance of the ground beneath it, the weight of the water above it, the seasonal variations of flow. After 50 years, the channel has moved significantly from where it began, but no single moment accounts for the change. The change is the aggregate of thousands of moments, each barely perceptible. The Alderton family's learning over the 4 decades of the aunt's governance followed this pattern. The lessons came in quietly, through letters and conversations and the occasional dramatic instructive failure, like Theodore's copper mine, but mostly through the subtle adjustments that happened when someone brought a plan to the aunts and found, in the asking, that the plan was slightly different by the time they left. Not wrong, necessarily. Sometimes it was more or less unchanged, but looked at, examined, put through a process that produced something more considered than what had gone in. The lesson most consistently transmitted was about the relationship between patience and outcome. This was Cordelia's lesson primarily. She taught it not through instruction, she did not lecture. The aunt's style was never to lecture, but through example and through the particular quality of her attention to time. She was interested in what things looked like over long periods, 10 years, 20 years. The Vermont timberland, which had been producing income since 1887, was for her the primary example, a patient choice, made before she was born, that continued to yield because the man who made it had thought beyond his own immediate needs. When a nephew or niece came to her with something urgent, she would often begin by asking what they thought the situation would look like in 10 years. Not as a delaying tactic, as a genuine inquiry into whether the urgency was real or manufactured by the compression of immediate circumstances. Most urgencies she had found were the latter. Most things that felt as though they required immediate action could, in fact, sustain a month or 2 of considered attention without suffering any harm. The ones that truly could not wait were relatively rare, and those ones she took seriously and moved on with appropriate speed. The distinction between real urgency and performed urgency was something the family gradually learned to make for themselves, having watched Cordelia make it so many times. Josephine's lesson was different. It was about the relationship between people, specifically about the gap between what people say and what they mean, and the importance of attending to both without confusing them. She was not a cynic. She did not believe that people's stated reasons for things were usually false, but she had observed, over many years of careful conversation, that people's stated reasons were rarely complete, that there was almost always something else behind the surface explanation, a fear, a hope, a private logic that drove the stated reason without being identical to it. She taught this not by pointing it out directly, but by asking the questions that brought it to the surface. A niece who said she wanted to sell her share of the family property in Providence because the market was favourable would find herself, in conversation with Josephine, explaining what she actually wanted to do with the money, which was different from what she had first implied. A nephew who said he wanted the trust's help with a business venture would find himself, somewhere in the tea and the gentle questions, articulating a more complex need. Partly the money, yes, but also the recognition from the family, also the sense of being trusted to handle something large. Josephine would address all of it. She would address the stated reason competently and the unstated need with equal, if quieter, care. Over time, the family developed a habit of doing this for each other, of asking the second question, the question behind the question. This was not universal, and it was not perfect. There were Alderton family members, particularly among the youngest generation by the 50s, who had not spent enough time with the aunts to have absorbed the habit, but among the older generation it was noticeable, and sometimes commented on by people who married into the family and found themselves in conversations with Alderton cousins that went somewhere unexpected, that arrived at the actual subject before they had expected to. The specific skill of money management was also transmitted unevenly but consistently. Cordelia had never given anyone a lecture on finance. She had never produced a pamphlet or a guide or any formalized version of what she knew. What she had done was include, From the time the next generation was old enough to attend the council meetings, a patient and transparent account of what the trust held, and what it earned, and what it cost, and why the various decisions about it had been made the way they were. She believed that if people understood why decisions had been made, they were better positioned to make similar decisions in the future. If they only knew what the decisions were, they would have to keep coming back to ask. This pedagogical impulse, she would not have used the word herself, but it describes the orientation, had effects that she observed with quiet satisfaction over the years. Nieces and nephews who had sat through 15 or 20 December council meetings had absorbed, without formal instruction, a working knowledge of trust management, property maintenance, conservative investment philosophy, and the particular kind of judgment that says, this is a good idea, but not a good idea right now. This knowledge did not make them professionals. It made them competent. It made them the kind of family members who could evaluate what their lawyers told them, rather than simply accepting it. Cordelia considered this the trust's most significant product. What the family learned about itself more broadly was harder to articulate. It was the thing that happened when you were part of an entity that had been in operation for a long time, and that had developed, over that time, a set of habits and expectations and preferences and ways of doing things. The family had a character, not the character of any individual member, of Cordelia's precision, or Josephine's warmth, or Theodore's weakness, or Philip's brilliance, but something aggregate and collective and partly self-aware. The family knew what it valued. It valued prudence and patience and the particular kind of loyalty that expressed itself in showing up, reliably, for the people who needed you. It valued privacy, not secrecy, but the distinction between what was the family's business and what was the world's. It was careful about what it said outside the family, not from any excessive discretion, but from the understanding that the outside world had uses for information that the family did not endorse. It valued the house on Alderton Lane as a specific place, a concrete centre around which everything else arranged itself. It valued the aunts as the custodians of this centre, without always being able to say precisely what custodianship meant or why it mattered. What the family learned in the end was what families learn when they are lucky and attentive enough to learn it, that inheritance is not only financial, that the most significant things that pass between generations are not recorded in trust documents or bank accounts, but in habits and values, and the specific quality of attention that one generation brings to the problems of the next. Cordelia and Josephine Alderton had not passed on only the house, and the timberland and the bonds in the New Haven portfolio. They had passed on a way of thinking about time, and a way of thinking about people, and a deep-seated suspicion of urgency that had saved the family from a number of mistakes it would otherwise certainly have made. This was not acknowledged in any formal ceremony. There was no moment when the family gathered and said, "You have taught us well." The learning was visible only in its effects, in the decisions that turned out correctly, in the crises that were avoided, in the marriages that held and the businesses that didn't fail, and the properties that were maintained, and the relationships that, against the general odds of large family dynamics, continued to be genuine rather than merely obligatory. These effects accumulated quietly, the way all learning accumulates, not as a sudden knowledge but as a slowly changed quality of response. The question of what gets passed on, and in what form, occupied Cordelia in the final decade of her active governance more than any other question. She had no illusions about the direct transferability of what she and Josephine had built. The specific practices, the specific relationships, the specific quality of the back parlour on a late afternoon in October, these could not be replicated. The next generation would have to find their own equivalents, or not, as their own circumstances and capacities allowed. What could be passed on was more abstract. It was the habit of asking, the understanding that attention is not passive but active, the conviction that what you tend well tends you. She wrote a document in 1959 that she did not call a memorandum and did not file with the trust records. She kept it in the second drawer of the library desk under the writing paper. It was 6 pages, and it described, in the plainest language she could manage, what she understood the function of the trust's advisory governance to be, not the legal function, which the lawyers understood, but the human function. Why it existed, what it was for, what qualities were required to do it well, what mistakes she had seen people make when they did it badly. She wrote it not as instructions, but as a description, the way you describe a place to someone who has not been there and who will need to find their own way to it once they arrive. She showed the document to Josephine, who read it carefully and said, after some time, that it was very good and that Cordelia should not change anything except one word in the third paragraph, where she had used the word management when the right word was care. Cordelia changed the word. She kept the document in the drawer. After her death, it would be found there by Charlotte, who would read it and understand immediately what it was and who it was for, and who would make 3 copies and give one to each of the family members she judged ready to receive it. Whether they would understand it the way she did was not something she could control. She gave it as Cordelia had given everything, with faith that the right person would make the right use of it at the right time. The capacity for faith of that particular kind, not the religious kind, though it had some of that quality, but the secular faith that good work done without guarantee of recognition or result is still worth doing, this was perhaps the deepest thing the aunts had taught. It ran against the natural human need for confirmation, for feedback, for the knowledge that what you had done had had the effect you intended. The trust produced its effects over decades, at a remove, through the mediation of other people's choices. You could not see them clearly. You could infer them from the shape of things, from the marriages that held and the businesses that survived and the properties that were maintained and the family members who, when tested by difficulty, turned out to be more capable than anyone had expected. These were the effects. They were real. They were just not legible in the way that effects are supposed to be legible, immediately and in direct proportion to the cause. The aunts had lived with this illegibility for 40 years and had continued doing the work anyway, which was, when you considered it plainly, an act of considerable faith. The house on Alderton Lane had always maintained a particular relationship to the world outside its iron gate, not a relationship of avoidance. The sisters were not recluses in any strict sense of the word. They attended church, participated in a limited range of civic life, maintained friendships outside the family, subscribed to 3 newspapers and read them. But they had, from early on, a clarity about the boundary between what was theirs and what was the world's, and this clarity produced a kind of insulation that the outside world's events moved through rather than displaced. The Depression had come to the Connecticut River Valley the way it came everywhere, not as an event but as a gradual change in the temperature of things. Men who had been employed in the textile mills found themselves unemployed. Families who had been comfortable found themselves careful. In town, the shop where Cordelia ordered her notepaper had closed by 1933, replaced by a general store that served a broader clientele with less selectivity. The hardware store reduced its hours. The hotel that had been on the green since 1894 converted part of its upper floors to rooming accommodation at lower rates. These changes were visible from the periphery of the Alderton household's life without reaching into it directly. Cordelia and Josephine were aware of the difference between their situation and that of others. This awareness was not comfortable. They were not people who could observe suffering in their immediate community with equanimity, and it expressed itself in the ways available to them. Modest and consistent contributions to the community food bank that operated out of the Congregational Church, the employment of a second person to help Mrs. Pratt for a year, when it would otherwise not have been necessary, the practice of paying tradespeople on the day of service, rather than at month's end, which was the convention, when month's end was when cash was thin. These contributions were not publicised. They were made as the natural exercise of a responsibility that the sisters understood themselves to have toward the community that had always surrounded the house. The war came in a different register. It arrived in December of 1941 and immediately reorganised the landscape of daily life in ways that the Depression had not. The Depression had taken things away. The war took people away. The family's young men left, nephews and cousins and the sons of people the aunts had known for decades. Some of them came back, some did not. The letters that came during those years were different from the Sunday letters Cordelia wrote in her usual rhythm. They were shorter, less deliberate, carrying more weight in fewer words because what needed to be said was too large for the regular language. She wrote to the nephews who were overseas. She wrote to them the way she wrote to everyone, with the specific detail of their lives acknowledged, the particular questions that mattered to them asked, the family's news given in the measured and steady voice of someone who was maintaining something on the home front that the men were fighting to return to. She did not say this explicitly. She didn't need to. The letters themselves said it. Their consistency said it. The Tuesday arrival of her writing at a field address somewhere in the Pacific or in France The cream paper, the blue ink address, the backward-leaning hand said, "This is still here. The house is still here. We are still here." Geoffrey's oldest son, James, had been the one Cordelia was most concerned about. He had gone to the Pacific in 1943 at 19. He had the family's temperament in one specific way. He was stubborn about his own judgment in ways that could be a strength and could be a vulnerability depending on what was being judged. She worried about him in a specific rather than a general way, the way you worry about a particular weakness in a structure you've been observing for years. James came home in 1945 thin and quiet in the manner of men who had seen things they were not yet able to talk about, which was most of them. He came to the house on Alderton Lane within 2 weeks of his return, partly because the family always came to the house at significant moments, and partly, Josephine thought, because he needed to see it. Needed to confirm that it was still exactly what it had been when he left, that some things had stayed in place while everything else moved. He sat in the back parlour for an afternoon. Josephine sat with him and did not require him to explain himself or narrate his experience or perform recovery. She offered him tea. She asked about practical things. Did he need anything? Where was he going to stay while he figured out his next steps? Had he eaten? He answered these questions with the attention of someone who has learned, through recent experience, to take practical questions seriously. After a while, he began, gradually and at his own pace, to talk about what he had seen. Not the worst of it, not yet, not for a long time, but the edge of it, the periphery. Josephine listened the way she always listened. When he stopped, which happened several times, she did not fill the silence. She let the silence be what it needed to be, which was room for him to decide whether to continue. Sometimes he continued. Sometimes he was quiet for a few minutes and then said something entirely different, asked about the garden, or asked about how Philip was doing, or asked about the council meeting that had happened in December while he was still overseas and what had been decided. He stayed for 3 days. When he left, he was not recovered. Recovery from that kind of experience takes years and follows its own particular course. But he was less alone with it. He had put some of it into language in a room that could hold it, and this was not nothing. It was in fact one of the things that rooms like this one are for. Rooms that have been used for 60 years for the serious, unhurried work of sitting with difficulty and not making it worse. The post-war years brought change to the Connecticut River Valley of a more benign kind. The economy recovered and then expanded. The suburbs that had been modest communities in 1940 were filling with new houses, new families, new roads, where there had been farms. The quality of things in the shops improved. More variety, more abundance than had been seen before the Depression. The television came to most households in the valley by the early 50s, including to the households of the nieces and nephews who lived nearby. It did not come to the house on Alderton Lane. Cordelia regarded it with the specific reserve she applied to things that required her to be passive, to receive rather than to engage. She preferred the newspaper, the books, the radio in the kitchen that played music in the mornings, and occasional news in the evenings. These required nothing from her. They offered what they offered, and she took what was useful and left the rest. The valley was changing, though not as fast as other parts of the country. The old families were mostly still there, reduced in some cases, reconstituted in others, but present in the specific way that old families are present, in the names on the mailboxes and on the town records and in the local histories that the library acquired, and that Josephine, as a user of that library for 40 years, had occasion to read. The Alderton name appeared in these histories occasionally, the original land grant, the trust's establishment, the house's construction in 1841. Reading these references, Josephine had the sensation of being part of something continuous, a thread that had been running through this particular landscape for a very long time and that continued for the moment to run. The world outside the gate was both less and more than it had been in their parents' time. Less in the sense of the specific social world that had defined their childhoods, the formal visits, the calling cards, the precise hierarchies of old Connecticut families that had ordered their youth. More in the sense of reach and possibility and information, and the sheer quantity of things happening in the world that could now be known about almost immediately. The two sisters moved between these conditions without particular distress. They had always lived partly in the present and partly in a longer time, a time measured in generations rather than decades, in the growth of oaks rather than the rise and fall of markets. That longer time had not changed. It continued to move at its own pace, indifferent to urgency, and they moved with it. There was a young man in the later years of the aunt's active governance who came to the house as the husband of a niece, and who spent an afternoon in conversation with Josephine that he described, 20 years afterward, as the most useful conversation of his adult life. His name was Martin. He was a physician, a specialist, a man of considerable intelligence and specific expertise in his field, who was at the time he came to the house experiencing what he could only describe as a crisis of direction. He was 40. He had achieved most of what he had set out to achieve. He was no longer certain what to set out to achieve next, and this uncertainty was uncomfortable in a way that surprised him, because he had not been an uncertain person before. Josephine had recognized something in him at lunch, a quality of distraction behind his courtesy, a slight quality of absence in his engagement with the conversation around the table. After lunch, when the others went out to the garden, she stayed inside with him on the pretext of clearing the table, and he stayed to help, and they found themselves in the kitchen with the quiet that settles after a meal and the particular privacy that kitchens offer, and she asked him how his work was going. He answered at first the way doctors answer that question, professionally, with the language of cases and advances and the latest developments in his field. She listened to this and asked a follow-up question that was not about the medicine. She asked what he thought the medicine was for. Not in the philosophical sense, she said, but in the specific sense. What did he think he was accomplishing in the particular work he was doing that he would not be accomplishing if he were doing something else entirely? What was the thing that only he could do, in the way he did it, that would stop being done if he stopped? Martin was quiet for a moment. Then he said that no one had ever asked him that his work had always been evaluated in terms of outcomes and publications and position in the field, and that the question of what the work was specifically for, in the sense she meant, had never come up. Josephine said that was interesting. She said that in her experience the people who stopped knowing what they were doing and why tended to stop doing it well, even when all the external measures of their performance remained good. She said she thought this was what had happened to him, and she asked if she was right. He said she was entirely right. They talked for an hour. By the end of it, he had articulated, with her help, what it was that he actually found meaningful in his work, which was not the specialty exactly, but a specific subset of it, the part that involved patients at the earlier stages of diagnosis, before certainty had settled, when what they needed was someone who could hold the uncertainty with them without projecting fear. He had always done this best. It was the part of his work that left him feeling at the end of a day that something real had happened. He had stopped noticing this. He had allowed the other demands of his position to crowd it out. The conversation in the kitchen helped him see it again, which allowed him to make changes, gradually over the following years, that realigned his practice with the part of it he had stopped seeing. Time, in the house on Alderton Lane, moved in 2 registers simultaneously. In the first register, the register of years and decades, of seasons completing and the family growing and the trust accounts accumulating their careful increments, time moved forward in the direction all time moves, without reversal and without pause. In the second register, the one particular to old houses and long lives, time moved differently, or not differently exactly, more visibly, more present to itself. The house in 1957 was not the same house as the house in 1927, but it was recognisably continuous with that earlier house, in a way that made the passage of 30 years feel less like change than like settling. Cordelia turned 71 in 1957. She was well by any reasonable standard. Her health was sound, her mind was precise and engaged. She continued to manage the Trust's correspondence with the same regularity that had characterised her management of it for 40 years. But she was aware, in the way that careful people become aware, of the margins narrowing. The arthritis in her right hand that would eventually end her letter writing was, in 1957, merely occasional stiffness. The reading glasses she had worn since 1940 were now bifocals. These were small adjustments. She made them without complaint and without the particular kind of vanity that makes small adjustments feel like large defeats. Josephine was 68. She had taken on more of the household management in the last several years, not because Cordelia had stepped back from anything significant, but because Josephine had moved toward it. She had always been more comfortable with the physical logistics of the house than Cordelia. The pantry inventory, the maintenance schedule, the conversations with the plumber and the carpenter who came when things needed attention. She found these tasks satisfying in a way that required no explanation. They were the tasks of keeping a thing working, and she understood keeping things working as an end in itself. Mrs. Pratt was now 63 and had adapted her schedule to the house's changing needs without being asked. She came 3 times a week now rather than 2, Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday. The Saturday visits were less formal than the others. She would tidy and prepare the week's meals in advance, leaving things in the refrigerator that Cordelia and Josephine could heat themselves, on the evenings when no visitors were expected. She had also, without announcement, begun doing the heavier cleaning that had always been done by the sisters themselves, the floor scrubbing, the window washing, the quarterly moving of furniture that revealed the floor's real condition beneath the rugs. She did not discuss this adjustment. She simply did it because it needed doing, and she could see that the doing of it was becoming harder. The visiting continued. The family's second and third generations had their own lives by now, careers and marriages and children who were beginning to be themselves rather than merely young, but the house on Alderton Lane remained a reference point in the family's geography. People came for the holidays and the council meetings, and they came at odd moments too. A niece taking a drive who stopped in for tea, a nephew with a crisis of decision who appeared with 48 hours' notice and stayed a weekend. The house absorbed these visits the way it absorbed everything, without disruption, making room without visible rearrangement, offering what it had always offered, the back parlour chairs, the tea, the quality of attention that could not be found elsewhere in quite this specific form. The conversations of the later years had a different tone than those of the middle years. Earlier the family had come with questions about futures, careers, marriages, properties, investments, the large decisions that needed making when lives were still in formation. Now, more often, people came with questions about pasts, with a particular need to understand how they had arrived where they were, to have the thread of their own story held up in good light by someone who had been watching it for a long time. Cordelia and Josephine were, for many family members, the people who had known them longest in a continuous way, who could hold a person's history from childhood through middle age without a gap, who could say, "I remember when you were 9 and you did this, and I can see the connection between that and what you are doing now." This function of the aunts, as the family's memory, its archive of individual histories, was perhaps the most valued and the least acknowledged of the things they provided. People did not come to the house on Alderton Lane and say, "I need someone who remembers me." They came for tea, for advice, for the particular quiet of the place, but in the conversations that developed, the thing that happened was often the thing they had needed, without knowing they needed it. Someone who knew them in time, who could place them in a story longer than any single moment of it. Charlotte, who came every month, brought her children to the house in the summers. Her son, who was 10 in 1955, had developed the habit, without being asked, which was the detail Josephine noticed, of sitting on the back porch on summer mornings with a book. He sat in the same chair every morning, the old cane chair with the faded green cushion that had been on the porch since anyone could remember. He read with the concentration of someone who is genuinely elsewhere, transported. Josephine watched this from the kitchen window with the kind of pleasure that is not possessive, that does not want to intrude or redirect, but simply notes a good thing with appreciation. She mentioned this boy to Cordelia one evening, describing what she had seen. Cordelia asked what he was reading. Josephine said she hadn't wanted to interrupt him to ask. Cordelia said she approved of that. They sat with this for a moment, the shared image of the child in the chair with the book, the quiet morning on the back porch, the old house holding him without asking anything of him. And the moment was one of the many small complete things that the later years produced, things that were not important by any measurable standard, but that had, in the accumulation, a weight equal to anything else the house had held. The trust, by the late 1950s, was in the hands of the second generation's most capable members in a practical sense. They attended the meetings, they reviewed the accounts, they made most of the routine decisions. Cordelia still chaired the December meeting, but the June meeting had been transferred to Geoffrey's eldest daughter, a woman of 45 named Margaret, who had inherited her mother's organisational capacity and her father's specific stubbornness, and had combined these into something that the aunts considered privately quite promising. Margaret ran the June meetings with a precision that Cordelia recognised and approved of without saying so directly. because saying so directly would have been condescending. She approved of it the way you approve of a tree that has grown correctly, by not intervening. The trust would continue. Cordelia understood this with the specific comfort of having planned for it. The documents were in order, the next generation knew what was required of them. The lawyers in New Haven had been managing this particular family's affairs for 30 years and could be expected to continue competently. The house would continue too, she was fairly confident. It was the kind of house that continued, that had enough weight of history in it, enough beauty that was not fashionable and therefore could not go out of fashion, enough usefulness as a centre for the family's ongoing life, to justify its maintenance in succeeding generations. She was not certain of this. She was fairly certain. In her understanding, fairly certain was as good as anyone could reasonably expect. What would not continue precisely was the thing she and Josephine had built together over 40 years, the specific quality of governance that was partly the trust's formal structure and partly the unstructured, patient, personal work that happened alongside the formal structure. This was not transferable in any direct sense. It had been produced by a specific pair of women in a specific house, over a specific period of time, and it would end when they ended, as all particular things end when their particular sources end. The family would carry what it had learned, unevenly and imperfectly, and with the gaps that always exist between what is taught and what is received. But the original thing, the back parlour, the cream letters, the Sunday evenings at the library desk, the questions asked in exactly the right tone at exactly the right moment, this would become memory, and then history, and then the kind of story that gets told at the December council table when someone wants to explain where the family's habits came from and why they should be kept. It is late now. The clock on the parlour mantelpiece has struck 9, then 10. The fire in the back parlour has burned down to embers, a low orange glow that the cast-iron screen catches and holds. The green curtains are drawn against the October dark. Outside, the old oaks are bare now, their branches visible against the sky, and the gravel drive is silver in the thin moonlight, empty, the iron gate closed. Cordelia has finished her letter. It is folded and sealed and propped against the lamp on the library desk, ready for the morning's post. She has written to Thomas, her nephew, the banker in Hartford, the one considering the marriage. She's not told him what to do. She's asked him 3 questions that he will need to think about, and the thinking about them will either produce clarity or produce more questions, and either outcome is better than moving forward without the thinking. She has told him, as she always tells each of them, that she is glad he wrote, that the family does not require his presence as often as she might like it, given the distance and the demands of his work, but that the letters are a genuine pleasure. This is true. She does not say things that are not true. Josephine is in the back parlour. The book she was reading an hour ago is on the side table, closed. She's not reading now. She's sitting with her hands in her lap, in the particular posture of someone who is not asleep and not quite awake, but inhabiting the space between, the comfortable borderland that the late evening makes available to people who are not anxious about what tomorrow will bring. The fire is low. The room is warm. She's thinking, in the unfocused way of late evenings, about Charlotte's boy in the garden chair with his book, about what he might grow into, about whether the family will hold together in the next generation the way it has held together in this one, about Robert Ellsworth briefly, as she sometimes does at this hour, without grief or longing, but with the simple acknowledgement of what was and what was not, and what the difference between them produced in her life. She does not arrive at conclusions about any of this. That is not what late evenings are for. Late evenings are for the thinking that is more like feeling, the slow turning of things in a mind that has given up its organisational ambitions for the day and is simply being with what it carries. Upstairs, the rooms are ready for sleep. The beds are turned down, Mrs. Pratt's last act of Tuesday's visit, the sheets folded back, the reading lamps adjusted, the water glasses filled. The house at this hour is very still. You can hear the tick of the parlour clock from the landing. You can hear the wind in the eaves, that particular sound of October wind in old eaves, which is low and continuous and not alarming, the sound of a house that has heard this wind before and knows how to hold against it. The house has always known how to hold against it. It was built to last by people who understood that the things worth building were the things that could outlast their builders. The brick of its walls is 112 years old. The oak of its floors has been polished so many times that it has developed a darkness at the centre of each board, a patina that no refinishing can remove because it is not on the surface of the wood but in it, absorbed over more than a century of use and care and the particular alchemy of old things that are well kept. In the morning the amber light will come in through the east window and fall across the floor of the east bedroom. The clock will strike 7. Mrs. Pratt will arrive at 8:30 on Thursday, come around to the back door, hang up her coat, put on the kettle. The letters will come at 10. The garden will still be sleeping under its October sky, the garlic underground and the rosemary silvered with the first faint frost, and the stone bench in the centre will hold its lichen quietly in the cold morning air. In the library, Cordelia's letter to Thomas will be collected, put in its envelope with the stamp she has already affixed, carried to the post. In New Haven, the lawyers will be at their desks. In Hartford, Thomas will be at his, going through the morning's papers, thinking about the questions his aunt has asked him, turning them over in his mind in the way she has taught the family to turn things over. Patiently, without rushing toward conclusion, giving the thinking the time it needs. And here, in the house at the end of the gravel drive, 2 sisters will move through the morning with the quiet efficiency of people who know their house and their routines and their purposes, with a completeness that requires no explanation. They will have breakfast. Cordelia will go to the library. Josephine will go to the garden, briefly, in her coat, to check the rosemary and note in her small notebook whether the frost did any damage, which it probably did not because the rosemary has been through 40 Connecticut winters and knows how to persist. The house will hold them as it always has, as it held their father before them and their mother and the children they never had and the family they tended, and the 40 years of Sundays and the 6 o'clock fires and the tea from the brown earthenware pot. It will hold all of it in the way that old houses hold things, not perfectly, not without loss, but continuously, and with the specific solidity of something that has been asked to stand for a long time, and has discovered, through the asking, that it can. Let the fire go to embers. Let the clock count out its soft measures in the dark parlour. Let the wind in the eaves say what it has always said, which is nothing more complicated than, here is a night, here is a house, here is a life well occupied. These are the ordinary facts of a place that has been lived in long and carefully. There is no drama to them. There is only the weight of time, which is not heavy exactly, more like settled. More like the weight of a house pressing gently into good New England soil, going nowhere, in no hurry to go. Sleep now. The house is still, the answer at rest. The clock ticks in the parlour and the fire is low and the letters are sealed, and tomorrow will come the way tomorrow always comes, without announcement, without explanation, simply present when you open your eyes. The gravel drive is silver in the moon. The iron gate is closed. The old oaks stand in the dark as they have always stood, patient and enormous and unhurried, knowing nothing about time except how to take a very great deal of it. The question that remains, after all of this, is the simplest one. What did it mean, this life? This particular arrangement of 2 women and 1 house, and 40 years of patient, invisible work? Not to the family, whose answer is measurable in the trust accounts and the marriages that held and the disasters avoided. Not to history, which knows nothing of the Alderton sisters and cares less. But to them, to Cordelia in the east room and Josephine in the west room, in the early mornings when the light came in or the late evenings when the clock struck and the house was quiet around them. The meaning was not complicated. It was the meaning of work done well over a long time, of a place tended with genuine care, of a companionship that had developed over 4 decades into something that could not be adequately described as friendship or sisterhood or love, but that contained something of all 3 and was more specific than any of them. It was the meaning of being known completely by one person and knowing them completely in return, which is as close as most people come to being seen. It was the meaning of the garden in August when the tomatoes were heavy on the vine and the bees were working the late summer flowers, and the afternoon light on the stone wall was a colour that had no proper name in English but that they both knew, without needing to name it, as theirs. It was the meaning of the Sunday letters, of the cream paper and the gold nib and the backward-leaning words going out into the world to do their quiet, careful work, of the questions that helped people think, of the silences that helped people arrive at what they needed to say, of the house that was always there, the iron gate at the end of the drive always closed and always available to be opened for whoever needed to come in. It was the meaning of being, for 40 years, the fixed point around which a family orbited and to which it returned at the moments that mattered. These are not small things. They are the things that most lives consist of when they are lived fully. The particular knowledge of a particular place, the sustained attention to a particular set of people, the patient work of maintenance and care across a span of time long enough for the work to become its own kind of monument. Not in stone, in the quality of what remains when the people who did the work are gone, the shape of the family, the habits of mind passed from one generation to the next, the way certain questions get asked in certain rooms, the way a house settles into its foundations and holds what it has been asked to hold. The clock ticks. The night is deep now. The Connecticut River Valley is sleeping under its October dark. The fields and the old oaks and the farmhouses and the slow river itself, all of it still, all of it in the patient process of being exactly what it is. The house on Alderton Lane is still. The aunts are asleep in their rooms, the east and the west, the first light not yet coming. Everything that needed to be done today has been done. Everything that needed to be said has been sent. The house breathes around them, as it has breathed for 112 years, deeply and without effort, and the night goes on. The house on Alderton Lane had, over its long life, developed the specific quality that only very old buildings in continuous use develop, the quality of having absorbed time, not in a mystical sense, in a material one. The walls held the temperature of decades of fires. The floors held the sound of footsteps, not literally, but in the sense that their grain had been worked and compressed and smoothed by so much use that they gave back the pressure of each step with a softness that newer floors did not have. The doors, hung on their original hardware, had been opened and closed so many times that they moved with an ease that required no effort. Not loose, not rattling, but perfectly calibrated to the hand, the way a well-used tool becomes calibrated. Cordelia was aware of this quality. She was aware of it in the mornings particularly, when she came downstairs before the house had been disturbed by anyone else, before Mrs. Pratt arrived or Josephine descended, when the house was in the specific state of having rested overnight and not yet been asked to perform its daily function. There was a quality to the light at this hour, before full morning, and a quality to the air, and a quality to the silence that was different from the evening silence because it was a silence leading forward rather than trailing behind. She moved through it without hurrying. She put the kettle on. She stood at the kitchen window with her first cup of tea and looked at the garden in its morning state. These mornings were, in the private accounting she kept of her own experience, among the things she valued most. Not because anything happened in them. Nothing happened. The kettle boiled. The tea steeped. The light changed as the sun cleared the line of the old oaks on the property's eastern edge. The garden went from grey to green to the specific colours of whatever season it was keeping. These things happened daily, and had happened daily for 50 years, and their repetition was not a diminishment but an accumulation. Each morning added itself to all the previous mornings, and the resulting weight was not heaviness but depth. You could stand in the kitchen at dawn in October 1953 and feel the weight of all the October dawns in this kitchen since 1841 pressing gently upward through the pine-board floor. Not threatening or insistent, simply present, like the deep note in a chord that you feel in your chest before you hear it in your ears. Josephine came downstairs at 7:30. She moved through the morning differently than Cordelia. Where Cordelia arrived at the kitchen with the deliberateness of someone who has already been thinking, Josephine arrived in the manner of someone who is still assembling herself, who comes to consciousness gradually and who benefits from the first hour's quiet before she's asked to be fully present. Cordelia had known this about her for 40 years, and had arranged the mornings accordingly. The tea was ready when Josephine came down. The kitchen was warm. Nothing was required of Josephine before she had finished her first cup except to be there, which she was, which was sufficient. They had, as a consequence of this arrangement, a first hour each morning that was less conversation than cohabitation. Two people in the same kitchen, doing the same small things without the demand of communication. Cordelia read the newspaper. Josephine looked at the garden. The kettle was occasionally refilled. If something occurred to one of them that seemed worth saying, she said it, and the other responded, and the conversation was brief, and then the silence returned. It was the silence of people who have said, over many years, most of the things they need to say, and who therefore treat silence not as an absence of communication, but as a form of it. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. And before you go, We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Did you grow up with an aunt or grandmother who quietly ran things behind the scenes? What did they know that nobody else seemed to know?